إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد بعدد كل داء ودواء وبارك وسلم عليه وعليهم كثيرا.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to part 3 and the final part on pre-Islamic poetry. There were just 2 poets left that we needed to cover, and I'm quickly going to cover them before we move into other parts of this presentation. So we covered Antara, we covered Al-Asha, we covered, and have you heard of Labid? Anybody heard of Labid before? Anybody? If you haven't, say you haven't. Come on, I want interaction. It's more lively and fun when there's interaction. Anybody heard of Labid?
No, I haven't.
Labid is one of the famous poets, and he's actually very famous for us because he is a companion of the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So he's a companion. So he's one of ours, right? And we'll have a look at his poetry. There's one poem that everybody should know, and as part of your homework, you have to memorize this poem as well. It's a very, very famous poem that he wrote about Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and everybody should know that poem. Certainly, everybody that's doing Sīrah should know this poem off their tongue, and they should roll it whenever they need to do it. So, can we have Safran? Do you want to read this, please? This is one of his poems.
Okay. Everything but Allah is vain, and all happiness unconditionally.
Okay, you can't read it like you're crying, Safran. You need to read it like it's a poem.
Okay.
Everything but Allah is vain, and all happiness unconditionally will vanish.
Everything but Allah is vain, and all happiness unconditionally will vanish. When a man is on a night journey, he thinks that he has accomplished some deed, but man spends his life in hopes. If you do not trust yourself, approve it. Perhaps the past would unclose it to you. When you do not find a father other than Adnan and Ma'ad, the judge, God, will punish you on the day when everybody will be informed of his deeds, when the record of his life is opened before Allah.
Okay, so he's talking about Adnan and Ma'ad when you do not find a father other than Adnan and Ma'ad. Anybody know who is referencing here? No? Okay, he's referencing the father of the Arabs. Adnan is the father of the Musta'arib Arabs, and Ma'ad it goes back to. So he's referencing here, and already we can see that his poetry has some wisdom in it. We mentioned that pre-Islamic poetry did have wisdom, but most of it was other than wisdom. So his poem, I like it because there's wisdom in his poetry. Can somebody read this? Shahid, please.
Narrated Abu Huraira, the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, "The truest words said by a poet was the words of Labid. He said, 'Verily everything except Allah is perishable,' and Umayyah bin Asalt was about to be a Muslim, but he did not embrace Islam."
Excellent.
Sahih Bukhari.
Excellent. Well done. You're becoming a poet in the way you recite, Shahid. Well done. Umayya bin As-Salt is another poet. We look at him as well. Right. Hatim At-Ta'i. Hatim At-Ta'i. Does everybody know who Hatim At-Ta'i is?
No.
Hatim At-Ta'i is the famous Hatim At-Ta'i, the one there's a proverbs in Arabic about him. He's the one who used to feed everybody. He's legendary for his generosity to the extent that he would suffer privations and hardship. He was also a poet, and his family features in the Sīrah, as we see when we get there. His sister's husband, sister was taken captive by the Muslims, the companions, on one of their battles. He was a Christian, even though he was a Christian from the pre-Islamic Arabia time. He is legendary. Even today, the Arabs say as generous as Hatim At-Ta'i. So he's one of the most famous figures in Arabic literature. Next week, when we study Jahili, inshallah, I'm going to give you all a book. It's called Literary History of the Arabs. Fascinating read, and everything should make sense to you now because we're at the end of Pre-Sīrah, so nothing in that book should not make sense to you, and I think it's a timely read. In there, you'll see some of his stories. He's famed for his generosity, hospitality, and gallantry. He came from an influential Christian family of Tay in Najd. He was raised by his mother after his father died, an extremely wealthy and generous lady. She annoyed her brothers due to her recklessness, so they seized her wealth of camels and they deprived her for a year or two. When they gave them back to her, thinking, right, she's learned her lesson, immediately she gave them to a needy woman, and she celebrated her bounty in some fine verses. So she made poetry when she did that. Hunger has made me so acutely conscious that I have taken an oath never to withhold food from a beggar. These are ad hoc, on the spot poems that the Arabs could make. Just like we have rappers or musicians that within half an hour they'll come out with a rap. They'll join two ideas together and they'll start doing it in front of you. If you've ever seen it done, that's how they do it. And within half an hour they've got a whole song going. And the same thing for the poets as well. So Hatim grew imbibing noble qualities of his mother. We don't know who his father was, but we know his mother, and he grew up under the sway of his mother and he imbibed her noble qualities. He would help everybody regardless. In Islam, total recklessness is blameworthy. You're supposed to withhold something for yourself and your family and then give as much as you want. He and pre-Islamic Arabs, they used to exaggerate in everything. So when it was bravery, extreme exaggeration. When it was generosity, extreme generosity. When it was privations, extreme privations. If you read the book, the Badu and his camel, or Man and his camel, that extra video that I made, Tizaj's book, I probably mentioned it in there as well. Or this particular story, I'm not sure if I mentioned it, but this is my daughter. Alhamdulillah, she's entered today. They mention in the story, they mention that they come across a Bedouin man that was incredibly poor. His clothes were falling apart. He was a sack of bones, but he was acutely admired by everybody. They just loved this guy, and they would mention again and again how generous he was. And he became generous. He became extremely poor due to his generosity. So he was barely surviving in life, like he was probably eating from people's plates. But they would admire him. That's just the way the Arabs work. This is the excesses that Islam came to curb. So he would do the same thing as well. His mother would do the same thing. He would go and find someone to eat with. If he didn't, he would throw his meal away. As opposed to Ibrahim alayhi salam, who would go and find somebody to eat with, and if he found somebody, he would eat with him. If he didn't find somebody, he would still eat by himself. But his first intention was to go and find somebody and share his meal with. This guy took it to another level. If he found somebody to eat with, good. If he didn't, throw the food away. This is the style of Jahiliyyah, right? So now there's a transition from refined poetry into Jahiliyyah slowly, inshallah, you'll start to see. One day, three important poets, these poets we've all mentioned before. Nabiha, his poetry was good, a very refined man, remember. Dubaini, and Abid bin al-Abras. These three came, they were on their way to the court of Al-Nu'man, the Luhmad king in Al-Hira, and they asked for something to eat, and he ended up slaughtering a camel each for them. He could have slaughtered a goat, or at the very extreme, slaughter a camel and say, okay, take the rest with you, or this is in your honor, the rest of the meat will be given to poor people. His extravagance made him slaughter 3 camels and gave them 1 each. God knows what they did with the rest of it. Did they feed poor people? I don't know. Or they threw it away? I don't know. But this is showing you what kind of a person he was. When they revealed themselves, he gave away all the camels, about 300. So when they finally said, by the way, this is who we are, you know, the renowned poets, he gave everything to them. In high spirits, he came to his grandfather, because he was living with his mother and grandfather, and he said, I've put a ring of eternal glory around your neck. In pre-Islamic Arabia, and even in Islamic times, it wasn't about your wealth, it wasn't about your status, it was about your honor. Your honor was your status. You could be the poorest chief in the world, but if you had honor, that was everything. And your honor was celebrated in poetry. And that's what made you live forever, because the Arabs didn't believe in an afterlife. So he said, I've put a ring of eternal glory around your neck. Today, our name has become so vast, so glorified, so ennobled, that I've put a ring of eternal glory around your neck. His grandfather said, what did you do? He told his grandfather, and his grandfather left him. He said, my nephew, my grandson's crazy in his extravagance, and he took up residence somewhere else. Though he was a fine poet, he never misused his poetic gifts. So he was very measured in his poetry. About 400 verses of his exist, earnest of tone and warmth of zeal. It is beautiful in form and noble in purpose. It thrills and delights. There is no satire, eulogies, or descriptions of natural phenomena such as animals, clouds, or storms, which is quite interesting and rare, because the Arabs always talk about natural phenomena and the animals around them, because there's nothing else to talk about. And they make fun of people, and then they, have a eulogy, which is when someone passes away or when someone's done something, you praise them. He denounces the miser. No, nothing new there. He's someone who hated misers. Then there was Umayyah bin Abi Salt. So this hadith in Bukhari mentions 2 poets. It mentions Labid and it mentions Umayyah bin As-Salt. He was another poet. Let's have a look about him. This guy's fascinating. For me, this guy is very fascinating. Like Hassan bin Thabit, Umayyah was a town poet. But unlike Hassan and most poets, his poetry strikes a new note. His poetry is poetry that I would like to read. By the way, it's very difficult to get hold of pre-Islamic poetry because large parts of it had never ever been translated into any language. You'll see 1 or 2, as we saw. You'll only find those. Search as you may, you will not find a lot of poetry translated. The Diwan of the Arabs still remains in the Arabic language. Kitab al-Aghani, which I want everybody to read, which is a sum of all the Arabic poetry up to the time the book was compiled. It's in Arabic. And then there's Yamul Arab, which are all of the stories of the Arabs. Again, it's in Arab. I tried to find some poetry, I couldn't. But his poetry is definitely some poetry I'd like to read. He was the second cousin of Rasulullah on his mother's side. He was an influential resident of At-Ta'if. He had visited Syria, Al-Yaman, and Bahrain. Now remember, we said that if you visited these places, it shows in your poetry. Your poetry expands because now your vision, horizon, and vocabulary has expanded. He had an inquisitive mind, keenly interested in religious inquiry. He had also read some of the revealed books and as a result hated idols and believed in one God. This is the interesting part why I like this guy. He shunned wine, wore coarse dress of camel or goat hair. His ideas about God, life after death, and human conduct closely resembled that of the Qur'an, as is shown in his poetry. Some commentators say he himself wanted to be the last prophet. That is why he was upset when Rasulullah was declared a prophet. Umayyah bin Abi as-Salt, there's a verse in the Quran that says, relate to them the story of the man to whom we sent our signs, but he passed them by, so Satan followed him up and he went astray. Some commentators of the Quran say this ayah refers exclusively to this particular guy. Some say he did acknowledge the Prophet, peace be upon him, when in Syria. He returned to Taif to get his belongings and joined the Prophet, but someone showed him the wells of Badr. As you know, the wells of Badr were filled with the dead on that day, and with 3 of his cousins and friends dead. This made him tear his clothes and weep. He came to Taif and died. The author of Khizan al-Adab has cited 16 verses of an ode from Umayyah's Diwan that praise Rasulullah and exhorts the readers to follow him and uphold the mission. I couldn't find these poems. They're probably in Arabic somewhere. So his poetry, 2 qualities highlight his poetry. Deep religious fervor. Don't forget, he's writing a lot of these poems. He was a Hanif. He was a monotheist, right? So he's writing these poems not with the influence of the Quran. This is pre that time or during that time. But his point of view before the Quran was his own monotheistic belief. So he is a man. There were, when we start the Sīrah, I mentioned 4 characters to you before, and we'll mention them again. And I used the thing, I said the 4 that got away. These were the 4 that rejected idolatry and they found their own way in life, and 3 of them became Christians. This guy, imagine this guy, you have to go against the grain. It's very difficult to do. It's easy to do if you're in a country like England where everybody is just, kullu wahid nafsi nafsi. Everybody just do what they want and nobody cares and don't care about anybody, the neighbors, and you don't feed anybody, nobody feeds you. Your children's relationships are not going to matter based upon your respect in society and all that sort of nonsense. Look at life in third world countries. You can't go against the grain. Society works together. You have a place in society, whether it's a religion or a sect or a social strata, you have a place in that society. And if you go against the grain, you've gone against everybody, you're ridiculed, you're cast aside, and it's very difficult to live. As we saw when the Rasul came with his message. So this guy was brave. For him to be doing what he did is brave. You're on your own against a whole nation. Well, nation's the wrong word to use. Against a whole country. Even a country is the wrong word to use, but you know what I'm trying to say. 2 qualities highlight his poetry: deep religious fervor and an earnest consciousness of the glory, might, and wisdom of God. He has a remarkable lucidity and a refinement of expression. A major part of his poetry praises God, describes his majesty, might, wisdom, his angels, and objects of his creation, such as the sun, the moon, the day, the night, the wind, the clouds, birds, and trees. To strike a moral or to furnish a warning, he refers to particular aspects of bygone prophets. This is something unique. A deep moral earnestness pervades this part of his poetry. He sometimes uses foreign words not known to Arabs. He exhorts his readers to give up passion, discipline their lives, and develop a sense of accountability to God. Every religion, he says, will be declared false on the day of judgment except the religion of Abraham, because he was a Hanif. There is a poem about Abraham and his son's sacrifice. His religious poems contain a few admirable poems in appreciation of the noble qualities of a great man of the Quraysh, Abdullah ibn Jud'an, noted for his generosity. So he seems like my kind of a guy. Now, moving on to the mu'allaqat. So we finished now, right? So we've moved away from there. We just want to discuss some problems with the mu'allaqat before we move into another area now. There is something I mentioned right in the beginning about the mu'allaqat. What is it? Does anybody know? Come on, class. I've got many people here. Speak up.
No.
The new Safran, you won't know, but the other people should, all of them should know. What did I say is the problem with the mu'allaqat?
Is it to do with them being hung up inside the Kaaba?
Yep. The fact that these lewd poems were hung up inside the Kaaba, and the fact that it's not mentioned in the Sīrah when the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, the Shia make a big deal about Sayyidina Ali being on the shoulders of Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and knocking down the idols. And the Sunnis, rightly so, we do as well, right? But the Shia make a big hoo-ha. So in their literature, in our literature, there's no mention of the fact that these poems were taken down. There's a mention in the Seerah of we don't know, I mean, we look at the authenticity of it. I don't think it's an authentic, it's actually, no, it's not an authentic story, but we have a story where Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam sees a picture of Isa alayhi salam and Maryam alayhi salam, and he protects it from, they were tearing down the idols, right? They were cleaning out the Kaaba, and he put his arm around that picture, protecting it from them desecrating it. Now, this is a story we as Muslims don't believe in, but the fact that it's mentioned shows you that had the mu'allaqat been hanging in the Kaaba, that someone would have mentioned it, right? So this is one of those same fantastic stories as the idols being dug up in Jeddah, as the people of Ad being in the south, and those kind of stories, right? How many lists of poets were there? Had the mu'allaqat been hanging in the Kaaba, we would have known. We wouldn't have said 7 or 9 or 10 or different on exactly who they were. We would have known 100% these are the people of the mu'allaqat. Each expert has his own idea on which were the best. So depending on who you ask, they will tell you who they believe is the best. And it's not always going to be because of academic criticism. It's going to be on tribal affiliations, the Mawali system, seeking favors, and stuff like that. But if you have a critical, objective eye, you can study the issues of what everybody says, and you can make your own judgment of which one is the best. And having looked at a little bit of the poems, clearly Imrul Qais stands out as someone whose head's above everybody else, head and shoulders above everybody else. His poem is also very illicit as well, but it's really, really nice. Now, I said to everybody that the reason I don't like the poetry is because of the boring messages. But that's not the only reason why people read those poems, by the way. If we get past what they're talking about, their descriptive nature of what they're describing is beautiful, right? When he keeps talking about the poem delights, the poem does this, it's exquisite, we're marrying language with descriptions here. So the way they will describe, we'll have a look at one, I think it's Labid's poem at the end, and I'll talk about what I mean. So in poetry, we have, for example, if I describe a flower, that's clear-cut language. The flower was on the napkin, and it looked like the red of the dying sun had come down and placed itself on the napkin. Okay, I don't know what quality of poem I just made up, but somebody who's a critic will say, okay, he's called a spade a spade. He's described a rose in the language of a rose, and he's trying to build metaphor by showing the reddishness of the rose by comparing it to the sun, the setting sun. Now, they will say there's nothing special about that. He's just speaking his own language. A rose is a rose is a rose is a rose is a rose. The sun setting is red. The red and the rose go together. There's nothing special in the metaphor. But if somebody says the rose was placed on the napkin as if the supernovas had exploded and were raining red stars. Now, this adds an extra level of delight to the poem. Why? If you're familiar with poetry, you know exactly what I've done here. If you're not, you're thinking, well, it's just as boring as his first poem. But the difference is that now I've used metaphor that is contrasting as opposed to matching. So I haven't said red sky, red poem. I've said a supernova. Now, a supernova is a violent action. A supernova is a destructive action. It's fire, it's energy, it's power. And on the other side, a rose is something that's delicate, it's moist, it's soft, it's perishable. How am I joining them together? You have to now take a few steps. Step 1, step 2, step 3. And each of those steps requires work from you as someone who's reading the poet. And when you get to the answer, you're thinking, okay, a supernova has red energy, and a supernova is beautiful as well, but it's fire, and he's used contrasting opposites to describe the same thing, and as if it was raining red stars. So you get this imagery of raining red stars that came from a supernova falling now on this on this napkin, right? This white napkin on a picnic party, whatever it may be. Now, this imagery, if you don't get there if you're someone who has an inquisitive mind, you're going to take step 1, step 2, step 3, and you're going to enjoy the journey. And when you get to the answer, it's like a moment of the wow moment that I told everybody about. I said the wow moments are what people live for. And that's a sign of a good poet. And that's a sign of a good reader. So pre-Islamic poetry that's what it's all about. That is exactly what it's all about. So if you can get past the boring stuff, there's many levels, right? So I don't like it because I find it boring. But if I started to look at it linguistically, wow, oh my God, this is stunning. And then if I started to look at it descriptively and try to get into the mind of what the reader's saying, that's another level of wow. Then the poems become absolutely amazing, right? So when I say that the poems are nothing special, I don't mean they're nothing special at all. No, these are stunning poems. If you can read them and understand them and understand the similes and the metaphors used, they are absolutely stunning poems. But I personally don't like them because I can find their counterparts in other poetry from around the world that more suits my style. That's the only reason why. But in no way did I infer that it's boring poetry. It's absolutely stunning. Well, it's boring from if you just look at it surface level, but it's absolutely stunning poetry otherwise. So if those who can read Arabic, have a look at those poems in Arabic, try to understand what's going on. Those who can only read English, find a commentary on the poem somewhere and try translating those poems, and you'll see into the eye of why Antara ibn Shaddad and Imr al-Qais and these guys were absolutely amazing. And how do these people find out which poem was greater than the other, which poet was more greater? This is what they're measuring. They're looking at these kind of things in the poet. They're looking at all the poems describe the same things. Antara is going to describe his sword like a flame. Another, Ibn al-Qais is going to describe it in the same way. Antara will describe it as a flash of lightning or a naked flame. And then Imr al-Qais will go one step deeper and he'll describe it in the same way, but then add the difference, like fire without smoke. And you're thinking, fire without smoke? What's fire without smoke? But once you understand it and the penny drops and you get the wow moment, you're going to say, oh my God, this guy's such a genius. This was the genius. That's why pre-Islamic poetry is up there with world-class poetry, because it's genius the way it's been done. And like I said, it had to be done that way because when the Qur'an arrived, the only way you'll find out that the Qur'an is something miraculous is if you know pre-Islamic poetry. Otherwise, you're just reading the Qur'an and you're saying, okay, nice message, nice warning, good tidings, a story, don't do this and do this, but you won't feel connected to the miraculous nature of the Quran. That only shows itself to you if you know pre-Islamic poetry. This is why the Quran came in a similar sort of style, yet it's not poetry. Bias, we mentioned bias. The grammarian Ahmad ibn Muhammad al-Nahas says on his commentary on the Mu'allaqat, the true view of the matter is this: when Hamad al-Rawai he's the rhapsodist, saw how little men cared for poetry. He collected these 7 pieces, urged people to study them, and said to them, "These are the poems of renown." This agrees with our information. The recitation of poems was his profession. Hamad lived in the 8th century. He was perhaps, of all men, the one who knew most Arabic poetry by heart. We assume he was responsible also for the somewhat fantastical title of the suspended odes. Right, so we think that it goes back to this guy, and there's probably a few more stories as well. Perhaps the oldest passage where this is stated is in the Iqt Afrid. Is that Aqtus? Iqt Afrid, the precious necklace of the Spanish Arab Ibn Abd Rabiha. Right, so I just want to read something from the book. There's too much to type here, so I'll just read something from the book on this. Okay, so he said, "We were there. The Arabs had such an interest in poetry and valued it so highly that they took 7 long pieces selected from the ancient poetry, wrote them in gold on pieces of Coptic lining, folded up and hung them up al-laqat on the curtains which covered the Kaaba. Hence we speak of the golden poems of Imrul Qais, the golden poem of Zuhair. The number of the golden poems is 7. They are also called the suspended mu'allaqat. Similar statements are found in later Arabic works, but against this we have the testimony of Nahas, who says in his commentary on the Mu'allaqat, as for the assertion that they were hung up in the Kaaba, it is not known to any of those who have handed down ancient poems. This cautious scholar is unquestionably right in rejecting a story so utterly unauthenticated. The customs of the Arabs before Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, are pretty known to us. We have also a mass of information about the affairs of Mecca at the time when the Prophet, peace be upon him, arose. But no trace of this or anything like it is found in really good and ancient authorities. We hear indeed of a Meccan hanging up a spoil of battle on the Kaaba. Less credible is the story of an important document being deposited in that sanctuary. For this looks like an instance of later usages being transferred to pre-Islamic times. But at all events, this is quite a different thing from the hanging up of a poetic manuscripts. To account for the disappearance of the mu'allaqat from the Kaaba, we are told in a passage of late origin that they were taken down at the capture of Mecca by the Prophet, peace be upon him. But in that case, we should expect some hint of the occurrence in the circumstantial biographies of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and in the works of the history of Mecca, and we find no such thing. That a series of long poems was written at all at that remote period is improbable in the extreme. Up to a time when the art of writing had become far more general than it was before the spread of Islam, poems were never or very rarely written, with the exception perhaps of epistles in poetic form. The diffusion of poetry was exclusively committed to oral tradition. Moreover, it is quite inconceivable that there should have been either a guild or a private individual of such acknowledged taste or of such influence as to bring about a consensus of opinion in favor of certain poems. Think of the mortal offense with which the canonization of one poet must have given to his rivals and their tribes. It was quite another thing for an individual to give his own private estimate of the respective merits of 2 poets who had appealed to him as umpire, or for a number of poets to appear at large gatherings such as the Fair of Waqas as candidates for the place of honor in the estimation of the throngs which listed to their restorations. Okay, it just carries on and on. Basically, it creates war. The poets we'll see in Jahiliyyah, their attacks. Poetry is a part of propaganda in war, and the smallest things would irk Arabs and they start fighting. So if someone ended up doing this and saying, these are the 7 and we're going to stick it up in the Kaaba, he had to be a Qurayshi, number 1. Nobody would allow anybody to stick anything in the Kaaba. And number 2, all of the Arabia would arise and say, who gives you the right to decide which poem is the best? Right? So this was done centuries. This story is just a fabricated story. So I hope I've laid this ghost to rest as well, just like we laid a few others to rest. Then he mentions anthologies. So there are different anthologies with different poems and with different names of which we're not going to go into. But if you're interested in that sort of thing, you can find it. Then he talks about the qasida, the which we'll go back to our reading. So what is the significance? We had a look at some poetry last time. We're going to have a look at more, but we haven't as of yet discussed the significance outside of the significance of for the exegetes, right? So there's many reasons. This is just one of them. I should have covered this. I didn't. So I'm going to take it back. There are a few reasons. Can you all think of some reasons, the significance of pre-Islamic poetry? Don't all go silent on me or speak all at once. Anybody? No? No ideas of why pre-Islamic poetry is amazing? The importance of it? Rank, reputation? Nope. Not rank, reputation. Pre-Islamic poetry is very important for us today. Very important. Why? Shahid, read this. So what is so important about a bunch of men chasing women, fighting, raiding, boasting, eating, etc.? Shahid, do the...
Number one, cultural identity and preservation of Arabic language.
Read.
Jahil poetry represents the apex of classical Arabic poetry and played a central role in shaping the Arabic language and its literary traditions. The intricate use of metaphor, rhythm, and alliteration in this poetry was a crucial part of Arabic culture, and poets were regarded as highly prestigious figures in society. The language and stylistic elements of Jahil poetry served as a foundation for later literary developments in the Islamic era.
Excellent, well done. So this is one reason. Second reason, can we have Safran, please? In your best voice now, Safran. Pep up. Safran, is he still around? Safran. He's probably gone to... Can we have Halima, do you want to read, please? Are these people just logging on and then walking away? Halima. All right, can we have Mariam reading, please?
Jahili poetry is a window into the social, political, and cultural life of pre-Islamic Arabs. The themes explored in the poetry often include tribalism, honor, revenge, love, war, and the harsh desert environment. The poets celebrated their tribal pride, and their works reflected the struggle for power and survival in the harsh conditions of the Arabian Peninsula. Tribalism. Many poems are centered on the importance of tribal identity, the honor of one's tribe, and the constant conflicts between rival tribes. Honoring the dead. Poets often composed elegies for fallen warriors, showing the importance of remembering the past and preserving the honor of the tribe. War and heroism. Poets depicted battles, heroes, and warriors, contributing to the warrior ethos that characterized much of pre-Islamic Arab culture.
Excellent, well done. So how do we know about pre-Islamic Arabian culture? We can only know through poetry. Outside of poetry, outside of the primary source material that you lot read, there's nothing. The Arabs have absolutely nothing to tell the world. We can only know about their lifestyle, their traditions, their culture, tribalism, honor, revenge, love, war, and the harsh desert, and even the animals. What animals were there back then? When they talk about lions, did you know there were lions up till recently in the Arabian desert? There's the Barbary lion. There were lions in Iran. There were, lions probably in Afghanistan as well, but they've just been killed off. They're extinct there now. Other stuff that's mentioned, certain flowers that may have been mentioned that you think, well, I've never seen these before, and if they're mentioned a few times, then they existed in the desert. They still do, but you've just never seen them. So the hunting, how they hunt, methods of what weapons they carry, all of this we don't know. We only know from primary source material outside, if it's there, or from the Arabs themselves. So this is the primary reason why It's very important. How the tribes would make peace, how they would go to war, how generosity would be shown. All of this is in their poetry. Right. Third person, Aisha, can you read, please?
The role of poets as social commentators. Poets in the Jahiliyyah were not just artists, they were also political commentators and advisors. Through their poems, they could critique tribal leaders, comment on the social order, and influence public opinion. They were deeply respected figures, sometimes even more so than tribal leaders or kings, because their words carried the power to elevate or destroy reputations.
Excellent, well done. So poets were people used to be scared of poets. You don't want to anger a Jahili poet, because if you did, he'd write something against you, and forever you and your tribe's nose would be cut, and you'd be disgraced. We looked at Tarafa, how he in the court of Hira, the king wanted to get rid of him, but the king couldn't kill him outright because he was worried about his tribe, because he had poets in his tribe, and his tribe would then have known what happened and made poetry against him. So he's not worried about being invaded by other tribes so much as he's worried about somebody crafting a poem against him, a lampoon or a satire that would damage his name and his family name forever afterwards. Right? So you can think of it as war propaganda. You want misinformation out there, write a poem. You want information out there, write a poem. You want to send a message across, the Arabs would send that message across in poetic form. If I was a commander of an army and I wanted one of you as my foot soldiers to go and deliver the message to the king that we needed more people, I wouldn't craft a letter, or I wouldn't say memorize these words in prose. No, I would make a poem, and you would memorize that poem, and you would give that poem, and that poem would then decide the result of whether the king helped me or not. Why poetry? Because poetry was seen as a more reliable form than prose. You don't forget poems. This is why even today in schools, poems that you learnt as children, and like nursery rhymes like Ringa Ringa Roses or Baba Black Sheep or London Bridge is Falling Down, why is it 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years after you heard those, you remember them perfectly? Because you learnt them. It's like a rhyming something, right? There's a rhyme and a rhythm, and there's end words are the same. It's like some kind of poetry, if you want to call it that. You don't forget. So likewise, those guys would remember the poems, and it was seen as his message was more reliable if it came in the form of poetry. Also, this is why in the early period you see that Ibn Ishaq, if you look at his Sīrah, which you would never be able to read, about 30% of it is poetry. His works is seen as more authentic if he peppers it with poetry, because they can rely on the poetry more than they can rely on his prose. And if his poetry matches the prose, and they're like, okay, that story must be true as well, right? So this is the power of poetry. And you could make peace, you could make wars, you could lift somebody, you could destroy somebody. It's a very, very powerful medium that they had. And a wise poet could use poetry, or a clever poet, to his advantage and become very rich very quickly. Halima?
Spiritual and philosophical reflections. While the poetry is primarily concerned with worldly matters, there are also moments of philosophical reflection on the life, death, fate, and the divine. Some poets, especially in the later stages of the Jahiliyyah period, expressed a sense of existential questioning, pondering the transient nature of the life and the uncertainty of human existence.
Thank you, well done. So, as we mentioned, that most of Jahili poetry was concerned with drinking, women, fighting, and very materialistic, here and now kind of things. But there's also ultimately a sense of sadness in their poems, which contrasts 180 degrees with the Qur'an. And what I'm talking about, I'll mention it when I get to the Qur'an side. You can see a sense of longing, a sense of, is this it? A sense of sadness, and all of that in their poetry. And when they change from the nasib to the rihla, the idea is disengagement, and let's do something else now to get over our loss. And some of them, they do talk about existential questioning, pondering the transit nature of life and death. Those are the intelligent ones, and you do come across it sometimes in their poetry, and it's nice. That's the kind of poetry that I like. So when Imrul Qais talks about, he hears the cry, the howl of a wolf, and he crafts this poem saying, you're on your own and I'm on my own, and when two people are on their own in life, they have each other for company. And I felt that was a very deep poem for him, because he was someone, remember, he lost everything. He was a king, a prince that lost his kingdom. He lost his followers, he lost his people. He had the Asad tribe were after him, the Lughmats were after him, and he was running around the Arabian Peninsula, and then he even went as far as Rome, and then they say that the Roman emperor had him killed. Whether that's true or not, we don't know, but as part of his story, he was someone that suffered a lot, and for him to then come out with something like this, you can really feel where he's coming from. So this is another thing that you get in their poetry, which is quite nice, actually. Can we have Safran, please? Safran's done a runner.
Yes.
Safran, read, please.
I just went to pray Maghrib,
Okay.
so that's what. Okay.
Kabbalah.
Influence on Islamic poetry and thought. Jahili poetry laid the foundation for much of the Islamic poetic tradition. The Qur'an, while distinct and revolutionary in its message, was delivered in a style that was deeply rooted in the pre-Islamic poetic form and language. Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself was known to be a part of a society that revered poetry, and the Arab poetic tradition played a role in shaping his communication style.
Excellent. So you'll see this when we look at the Quran, inshallah, we'll touch on this part. But certainly you'd see how pre-Islamic poetry influenced the poetry of Islamic poetry moving forward, and Persian poetry and Urdu poetry as well. And we'll see examples of that as well, inshallah. Aesthetic and artistic significance. Shahid. Oh, Shahid just sent me a message saying excuse him. Okay, I'll read this part. Jahili poetry is admired for its aesthetic qualities. This is what I was talking about, including its mastery of the qasida, which were long and intricate poetic forms with a set structure. The meter and the rhyme of these poems are still studied and revered by literary scholars. The useful use of imagery and symbolism in these works is often considered a high point in classical Arabic literature. Mariam, do you want to read? Mariam. Aisha, do you want to read, please?
Yeah, moral and ethical lessons. While many of the themes of Jahili poetry focused on worldly matters, the poems often convey deep moral and ethical lessons. Many poems contained reflections on the concepts of honor, loyalty, bravery, and justice, providing a moral code that guided social relations and conduct within tribes. In summary, pre-Islamic Jahili poetry is a cornerstone of Arabic literary and cultural history. It provides invaluable insight into the values, beliefs, and struggles of early Arab society, and has deeply influenced the later development of Islamic thought and literature. Its importance extends beyond mere aesthetics. It reflects the lived experiences, philosophical musings, and social dynamics of a crucial historical period.
Excellent. Well done, well done. So there's many reasons why we need to keep hold of this. Last lesson, we looked at the nasib only, right? I kept saying nasab, it's nasib, which was the prelude, the romantic prelude, the amatory prelude. There's actually 3 parts to the poem. We'll have a look at all 3 parts. So pre-Islamic Jahili poetry typically follows a 3-part structure. You need to know this is because when you write your own poetry, this is what you're going to follow. The nasib This is the romantic or nostalgic opening where the poet reflects on lost love, past happiness, or the ruins, atlal, of a beloved's encampment. The rahil, the journey section, often describing the poet's travels, hardships, or the beauty and endurance of his camel. It may also contain vivid depictions of nature. Then there is the fakhr or gharad, this is the main theme or the purpose of the poem, which could be boasting, fakhr, praise, madh, satire, hija, or wisdom, hikmah. This structure is most famously seen in the qasida, the classical Arabic ode. Some of the small ones don't, there's not enough room for them to develop these ideas, even though small ones can have one, two, and three. But the qasidas definitely all have this, and we saw many examples of this last lesson. So let's have a look at the nasib. What's the purpose of the nasib? The nasib is the emotional opening of the poem where the poet expresses nostalgia for lost love, past happiness, or the vanished campsite of his beloved. We saw examples of this in all of the poems, some of the poems, but they're all like this. It is a key feature of Jahili poetry and serves to capture the audience's emotions before transitioning to the rest of the poem. What's the purpose of this? It sets the tone for what's going to come. Depending on how you start your nasib, it gives an idea to everybody where your poem is heading or how deep you're going to get into things, right? So the key features of the nasib are ruins and remembrance. Waquf al-Atlal is a theme that features in every single pre-Islamic ode like this. The poet often begins by pausing at the deserted campsite of his beloved and lamenting her absence. This technique, known as waquf ala al-atlal, standing at the ruins, was a standard convention in pre-Islamic poetry. So the ruins could be a campsite, a campfire, or a hut where they met, or some kind of shelter, or a tent, or anything like this, right? So the idea is that they had a small amount of time together, and then she went, and then he visited the next day or 2 days later, and he can only see the ruins of what was there before. For me, this is exactly the opposite of the Quran. I mean, it starts from sadness, it starts from loss, it starts from pain. The poetry starts from this. Sensory descriptions, the poet vividly describes the sights, sounds, and smells associated with his lost love. Love and passion, he reminisces about his past romance, emphasizing beauty, longing, and unfulfilled desires. Tears and emotional pain. Many poets emphasize weeping over the ruins, showing the depth of their sorrow. Examples from Imrul Qais. Shahid, are you back? No, he's not back yet. Can we, not Aisha, Mariam,
Yes.
do you want to read on the left-hand side? Do you want to read the example of the nasib of Imrul Qais?
Okay.
You can read the English. You don't need to read the Arabic. Don't worry.
Sorry. I don't mind reading the Arabic as well.
Okay.
So should I just?
Yeah.
Okay. بسخط اللواء بين الدخول فحوملي قفا نبكي من ذكرى حبيب ومنزلي. Sorry, that was off tune. Stop and let us weep for the memory of a beloved and her dwelling. In the sands of Liwa, between Dakhul and Hawmal, this famous opening by Imrul Qais, the father of Arabic poetry, shows the poet pausing at the ruins, calling upon his companions to mourn with him.
Cool. Excellent. Well done, mashallah. Message from someone. So the aim of the nasib is to simultaneously strike a note in the first line to give some indication of the horizons of the qasida, pointing symbolically to its spirit and main purpose. Ibn Rishik says, whoever strikes Whoever strikes the right chord of Nasib has indeed entered from the door and placed his foot in the stirrup. That's a powerful statement there. So if you get your Nasib right, everything else that follows is going to be right. People will also listen to your poem. So Zuhair opens his Mu'allaka with a question implying the difficulty of recognizing the half-effaced traces of Awfa's abode. So he starts his qasida with, is this dumb trace of the campsite all that remains of Awfa? This introduces a subtle keynote to the main purpose of his qasida, namely his concern for the unrecognizable state of Banu Ghatfan following their fratricidal wars of Dohis and Al-Ghabra, which we'll look at in Jahiliya next week, inshallah. So you see what's happened now. Do you remember I gave you the example and I said to you, the rows on the picnic on the tea cloth, and then I took it, to like a metaphor, like a simile that was so far away from each other, like a supernova, right? And you have to take a few steps to understand what's going on. Likewise, when he said, "Is this dumb trace of the campsite all that remains of Awfa?" What he's really talking about is that his qasida is going to be about the problems, the unrecognizable state, because what these great tribes used to be and now where they are following these wars, unrecognizable, just as unrecognizable of the campsite of where yesterday there was a revelry and there was Awfa, and today there is just embers. So this, people who are intelligent, know exactly what he's going to talk about, and they're going to be like, this is going to be interesting. Let's listen to this. Do you all understand? Anthara's Mu'allaka opens with two questions. Have the poets left a single spot for a patch to be sewn? Or did you recognize the abode after long meditation? Antara's poem is one of protest and self-justification conveyed in a modest and dignified way. The manner in which he begins it is indicative both of his purpose and his style of approach. So do you understand what's happening now, right? So each time you read a romantic opening, there is a hidden message in there, right? So this is the beauty of these poets now. So now we're going into detail and we're going to get past the fact that they're boasting and fakhr and, those messages are in their own place. But we're looking at how they could string something so amazing together like this. Lightning is another theme that symbolizes yearning and nostalgia. Remember, we kept reading lightning and storms and rain clouds and rain. Beautiful descriptive poetry, but the meaning is deeper. It symbolizes yearning and nostalgia. Lovers meet at the season's rain and pastures. It can occur anywhere in the poem and has wide symbolism. Read from the book, which means that there's some information that needs to be given. Okay, so the Nasib denotes the amorous allusion to women, but Nasib has come to denote the formal amatory prelude to the qasida and similar introductory themes treating. Okay. The aim of the Nasib is simultaneously to strike a note in the first line to give some indication of the horizons of the qasida by pointing symbolically towards its spirit and main purpose, and to evoke the closely related elements of nostalgia. The dual actions of evoking nostalgia, feeling, and foreshadowing the purpose and the spirit of the qasida are inseparable. That is why Ibn Rushd says, whoever strikes the right chord of Nasib has indeed entered from the door and placed his foot in the stirrup. Zuhair opens, okay, we mentioned that one as well. Antara we mentioned. The first of the Nasib themes is allusion to the abode. Nostalgia and longing for his home territory are the eternal lot of the poet, who is in the Arab ideal the ever-wandering Bedouin. The mention of the abode, or indeed anything associated with it, evokes memories of the beloved and of past hours of happiness. The poet's heart is moved by anything reminiscent of it, the name of a land, its sand dunes, its hills, the stars that indicate the way it is to the traveler, the winds, breezes, the blow and to and fro it, the camp, the fireplace, the pegs in which animals are tethered, the heaps of ashes, the little mounds that protect the tent from flooding, and the like. A poet may use the words dar as a symbol for the loved one or as a symbol for himself. He may think of himself as the half-effaced traces of an encampment. Imrul Qais said in a famous opening verse, "A pleasant morning to you, O you faint traces of a dwelling. But can one lost in times gone by in truth find life pleasant? We know that here Imrul Qais means himself because he says later in this poem, "Oh, I am worn out on a worn out camel, a worn out man leading us, another worn out man following us." A poet may think of barely recognizable traces of an old encampment as representing his own bygone happiness and the days of his youth, as in Imrul Qais. Imrul Qais says, "You think Salama is there still, whilst you see only wild fawns or ostrich eggs in the floodbed where many were once encamped. Salama's night when she would reveal to you smiling daintily, set teeth, a neck gazelle like you, not adorned." A poet sometimes identifies himself and his past with the ashes of old campfires, as in the opening line of Tarafa. Did the spring encampment stir a sadness in you, or was it being so old, or its ashes their coals long extinguished? Okay, so we get the idea. Lightning is an important theme, right? We will bypass that. Then the second part is disengagement. This is the second part of the oud now. The khallus, this is where you disengage. So you're lost in this thought, you're sad, there is there is remorsefulness, there is a desire for something better, whether it be for yourself, whether it be for the beloved, whether it be for the tribes, whether it be for whatever you're trying to hint at here. But you disengage yourself from that, you come out of that feeling, and the best way to do that is by describing a camel ride, because when you describe a camel ride or a horse ride, it's fast, it's furious, it's fun, it's engaging, and it's totally taken you away from your sadness. And a journey to reach the love done in a distant place. So the love could be real love, or it could be something you want to achieve for yourself. For Imrul Qais, if he mentioned something like this, it would have been the fact that he didn't achieve what he set out to achieve, which is take his kingdom back. Also, when it comes to the other guy who did it, is the reconciliation between tribes. Of the 7 mu'allaqat, only 4 have takhassus of this type. So let's read something. The disengagement forms the second section. Towards main motive, this may achieve the... Okay. Only 2 of the mu'allaqats treat the camel and journey at length, though in different ways. Each is considered a model treatment of this theme. Tarafa begins, but when grief assails me, straight away I ride it off, mounting on my swift, lean-planked camel, night and day racing. Then he follows detailed description of the animal. Right, the curve of the camel's back is like a Roman arch of burnt brick, its tail here like the feathers of the wings of an eagle, the graceful movements of its tail like those of a serving girl flouncing the train of her skirts before her master at the drinking party. Tarafa describes a she-camel, blah, blah, blah. Right. So then we have the main. Okay, let's have a look at the Rahil a bit more. So this is the second part, right? So the khallus can take the form of a journey, which is the Rahil. The Shahid, you want to read?
The Rahil, which means departure or travel, follows the Nasib and represents a transition. Here the poet moves away from emotional nostalgia and begins describing a physical journey through the desert. Key features of the Rahil: the camel, al-Naqah. The poet describes the camel in great detail, portraying his endurance, strength, and loyalty. The camel serves as a metaphor for the poet's resilience. Harsh desert landscape. The poet points to a vivid picture of sandstone mountains, wild animals, and oases, emphasizing his endurance in extreme conditions. Personal strength and experience. By showcasing his ability to survive the challenges of the desert, the poet subtly builds his own heroic image. Example from Antara ibn Shaddad. He drags along his sides like a water skin, held back by the scars of battle and hardship. So in this verse, the poet describes his camel as if it is a fellow warrior, showing its endurance through hardships. The Rahil serves as a bridge between the Nasib, emotional prelude, and the final section where the poet states his main purpose.
Well done, well done. So then the final section, which is the main theme, the gharad. The Takhallus journey expresses the attempt at seeking relief from the intense emotion of the Nasib. And remember, that's hidden language, right? So it could be many things in the Nasib. The journey pictured in terms of camel deserts and sympathetic communication with aspects of nature symbolizes the poet's endeavor to change from an introvert to an extrovert mood. The path of the journey leads into the main theme, in which comes the ultimate sense of relief. So from the book, there were four main purposes for which the Qasida was wholly or partly composed: panegyric, lampooning, love, ghazal, and lamentation. So a panegyric is where you praise somebody because you need something, you praise them. Lampooning is when you obviously lampoon somebody. The ghazal is it's like a love poem and a lamentation. According to some critics, all the other purposes may be considered as stemming from these basic themes. For example, the poems of protest and apology composed by Al-Nabigha and addressed to Nu'man al-Mundar, the king of Al-Hira, is in essence qasida. However you change it, they will fall into this. Some may have more, some may have aspects of wasf in there, which is aphorisms or wise sayings or something. But this is the main gist is these four ideas. It's going to be a love poem, a lampoon, and satire. Lampoon is the same. It's going to be a petition, or it's going to be a lamentation. Normally, it was the women. Women played a significant role in poetry, even in the Islamic period. But most of their poetry is lamentation poetry. And then obviously there's glorification, right? You have fakhr. Fakhr, they say, is a separate entity from panegyric, right? The latter being most cases addressed to a patron. Fakhr is about yourself and your own tribe. So the ghazal theme is love. I don't want to go too much into that. The lampoon, they were broadly speaking three categories of panegyric, thus inspiring. The second category is resembling the type of love. Okay, we will leave that out. Lampoon is implicit or explicit, so you can attach the name. For example, Imrul Qais addressed to a woman called Hind. Hind, don't marry a half-wit with his baby hair still not shaven off. Arab boys had a tuft of long hair which is shaved off on attaining puberty, and with white patches on his skin, amulets on his wrists with a deformity in his wrist, and who looks for a hair to tie its ankle bone to his leg as an amulet. So this is what they used to do, like the foot of a hare. In fear that he perish. No garrulous fool am I, sitting in company, not ever falling into trouble, nor blabbing idiot, nor yet irresolute, weakly consulting others' advice, submitting through against. So this is explicit. And then there's implicit. Then there's fakhr, which is about tribe. Then there's eulogy and aphorisms, wise sayings. I'm not going to go through any of them. Then there's description, wasaf, small head, small of head, hollow chested, right? Knock-kneed, ankle bones brushing with small short ears as if cropped, and a simple smile as in al-ashas, slender like a lean filly. This is Zuhair's description of an ostrich. So the fakhr, can we have Aisha read, please?
This is the core purpose of the poem, where the poet shifts from personal emotions and journey descriptions to a direct expression of his main message. The gharad refers to the theme or purpose of the poetry, which could include common themes in this section: fakhr, boasting. The poet brags about his own bravery, lineage, generosity, and strength. Hijab, satire or mockery. The poet insults his enemies, ridiculing their cowardice, dishonor, or lack of generosity. Madh, praise. The poet praises a patron, a tribe, or a leader, often in return for sorry, how do you say it?
I'm just as bad as you. Patronage.
Oh, sorry, patronage. Hikmah, wisdom and reflection. Some poets use this section for moral lessons, philosophical thoughts, or general wisdom. Example from Al-Shanqiti Shinfara. I continue my journey through the evening, enduring hardships, and I continue my self-company as I thread the difficult paths. In this verse, Shanfara, as a famous outlaw poet, emphasizes his independence and resilience, showing his pride in his living outside tribal society. This is an example of fakhr, boasting.
Thank you very much. So in summary, all of you remember, because you're going to be writing a poem for this week, next week, inshallah, using the same pre-Islamic Arabian themes, right? So you're going to have a nasib, you're going to have the al-rahil, and the ending bit is probably going to be a panegyric or something, because it's on Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, right? So you're going to praise Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, or you're going to have some wisdom. Right, I don't know how you're going to do the camel hardship desert endurance, but that's something for you to work out. And love, nostalgia, ruins, that shouldn't be too difficult. Okay, I'll have this on PDF inshallah, because I will have finished the 3 parts of Pre-Islamic poetry, and then I can make the PDFs. So generally these are the themes, right? So we have love, ghazal, wasf, description, madh, praise, fakhr, self-glorification, hija, lampoon, nath'a, lamentation, hikmah, wise sayings, aphorisms, rith'a, elegy, and panegyric. These are anything else is going to be inside these topics, but these are generally the themes of pre-Islamic poetry that you get. So poetry's it's always been celebrated. Can somebody tell me, I don't want anybody to see this, I should have numbered it, but I didn't. Can somebody tell me why poetry has been celebrated more than any other medium in pre-Islamic Arabia? Anybody tell me? No?
Is that because a lot of the Arabs may have been illiterate as well, and obviously poetry was the easiest way to pass on messages?
Excellent. You basically hit the nail on the head. So poetry has been celebrated in Arab culture from the earliest periods onwards as its most prominent and most celebrated art form. Music, painting, architecture, and other forms of literature have never come close to rivaling poetry. And you can understand why, right? Because architecture, you won't get that in the desert. Literature, you would not get as well. Painting, you're not going to get. Music, yes, you'll get. But how good is Bedouin music going to be compared to Persian music or Roman music? So poetry was the only form that they had. And the way I always explain it is that imagine you have a ruby and you throw that ruby into a garden, a rose garden, and it disappears amongst the roses. But you throw that ruby into a desert and it sticks out even more. That's the analogy of poetry for the Arabs. Right? When you have nothing and you just have a blank desert and you throw a ruby there, a big ruby, and it will look stunning and absolutely beautiful. It will look inside on the desert floor, the yellow sand with this ruby, and then if you had it in a walled garden, let's say, what's the difference between a ruby and a rose? You've thrown it amongst the rose beds and it just gets covered by the roses. So this is my analogy of poetry for the Arabs. To understand it as a purely art form would be misunderstanding it, because we told you what the significance of poetry for the Arabs was. It went a lot deeper than just as an art form. In early Arab culture, poetry played a significant role as a mode of communication that was considered more reliable than prose. Poems are more easily memorized and thus the information conveyed more authentic. It was used as news, as I mentioned, collective memory. You can preserve things about your lineages, about your affairs, your tribal affairs in poems. Prestige for tribes and families. Any tribe that had a poet they would celebrate, especially the family. It's like, you've got a poet. Poetry is not something that you can just make up. You either have the gift to be a true poet, or you just get by like everybody else. So true poets, this is the reason why you don't get Abu Lahab or Abu Jahl, writing poems against Rasulullah, because they didn't have the qualities or the skills, right? So you need to have that inbuilt skill inside you. Prestige for tribes and family. As a result, the delivery of important messages, which I mentioned, later use alongside prose to give prose more authenticity. Ibn Ishaq, in the first person to Yeah, it was always done in the first person accounts with chains of narration. What we have in prose today is prose is always written in the past tense and in the third person. You're talking about he went to the shops and bought himself a Snickers bar. Now you've taken it away from one level of authenticity. Where did you get this news from? That he went to the shop and bought a Snickers bar. Whereas if I had said, I went to the shop and bought a Snickers bar, that's more authentic. I'm talking about myself. I'm narrating something that happened to me. So this is why in traditional narratives, you'll always get first person narrations. And in hadith and in akhbar, you will hear, you have Ibn Hisaq gives a plethora of chains of narration. Tabari, they'll mention one thing and they'll give 3 or 4 different chains. With every slight different version of events, they'll mention all of the stories. Why? Because it lends more credibility than if somebody says, and I heard him do this. Right? So this is the reason why people make that mistake with the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam committing suicide. Na'udhu billah. It just takes basic understanding of the rules of narrations for pre-Islamic Arabs and early Arabs, Muslim Arabs, to know that why that story is not sound. And we'll touch upon that story, as I promised you, when we get to the beginning of the Sīrah, because it occurs very close to the revelation, basically. So this is why it's important. You start picking up hadith, or you start picking up stories about Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and you don't know the context. You don't know pre-Islamic Arabia. You don't know how they used to narrate. You don't know what they meant when they uttered certain phrases, and then you're going to make a mess of everything. This is why I say to you, learn the sciences properly, and especially learn pre-Islamic history properly, so you don't make those mistakes. So when Tabari and these people mention first person account 1, first person account 2, first person account 3, they've jumbled all of them up and put them all together. They're saying, look, this is how it is. Right? It's first person, first person, first person. They're all authentic, somewhat authentic, and now join the dots and make the most realistic picture. But all of a sudden, when they say, and it is said to us, or we have heard, you come across this in the books, right? Or they say, straight away you know that that's weak now. That's very weak. And that's exactly what happened with Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. It says, and they say. Right? So the minute you see something in Bukhari that says, and they say, there's a problem now. And this is the crucial part that people miss when they read that hadith in Bukhari. So this is the reason why in poetry they're talking in the first person. You never hear, and Layla was doing this, and Layla was doing that, and Majnun was doing this. No, it's always, I was walking amongst the gardens of Layla, kissing the town of the village of Layla, kissing this wall and kissing that, not because of the walls, but because of who dwelt within. So the poem is in first person. It lends more authenticity to it. If Qais is saying it himself, then that's credible. But if third people have to tell you hundreds of years later, possibly, or even 50 years later, and say, yeah, this is what he did in the past tense, now there's a problem. How does it differ from poetry around the world? Okay, so how does pre-Islamic poetry differ from poetry around the world? Let's have some more reading. Aisha, please start.
Structure and form. Qasida, the dominant form of pre-Islamic poetry was the qasida, a long monorhyme ode that could exceed 550 verses. Each line was composed of 2 hemistiches. Okay. Halves with a consistent meter and rhyme, strict metrical rules. The poetry followed the urud system of prosody based on quantitative meter rather than stress, unlike English poetry, and monorhyme. Every line ended in the same rhythm sound, which is quite different from the varied rhyming patterns in Western poetry.
Thank you, well done. Shahid, please, number 2.
Tribal identity and pride. Much of the poetry revolved around tribal honor, mufakkara, boasting about one's tribe, ancestors and victories. The Nasib, love prelude. Many qasidas begin with a melancholic romantic prelude where the poet lamented lost love and wept over abandoned campsites at Lal. Nature and harsh desert life. Poets describe the Arabian desert vividly, often using powerful imagery of camels, storms and battles. Bravery and generosity, ideal values in Arab society, courage, shaka, loyalty, wafa, and generosity, karam, were frequently celebrated. Satire and lampoons, hija. Poets attacked rivals through sharp, humiliating verses, a practice that had a social and even political consequences.
Well done, thank you. So in poetry from around the world is written on many different genres, and sometimes you get certain cultural systems that appear for 100 years, and then they will fit that paradigm, and then there will be a rebellion against it, and then they'll try to write poetry in a different way, and it starts a new trend. But with the Arabs, it was very rigid. This is what it was all about. All of their poems in pre-Islamic Arabia are only going to touch on 90% are going to touch on these themes. Oral tradition, I'll read this. Oral tradition and performance. Unlike much of early European poetry, which was often written down, pre-Islamic poetry was an oral tradition passed down by professional poets and reciters, rawis. Poets had high status in Arab society and could influence politics, warfare, and diplomacy. Poetry competitions were held at places like Uqad, a major pre-Islamic fair. Remember, we did this, the 12 markets of Arabia, and Uqad was the one that the Qurayshis used to administer. Can we have Safran, please?
Comparison with other traditions, Greek and Roman poetry. While Greek poetry, e.g. Homer's Iliad, was also oral and celebrated heroic themes, it relied more on epic narrative, while Arabic poetry was lyrical and personal. Chinese and Japanese poetry. Classical Chinese poetry, e.g. Tang Dynasty poetry, was much shorter and often centered on nature, philosophy, and introspection rather than tribal war and honor. Persian poetry, pre-Islamic and later. Pre-Islamic Persian poetry was likely less structured, while later Persian poetry, e.g. Rumi, Ferdowsi, focused more on mysticism, romance, and moral lessons. European medieval poetry. Troubadour poetry in medieval Europe had themes of courtly love, which differs from the more raw, rugged emotions of pre-Islamic Arabic poetry.
Thank you, well done. Legacy. Pre-Islamic poetry became the foundation for classical Arabic poetry and influenced Islamic era poets like Al-Mutanabbi, Al-Farazdak, and Abu Nawas. It also shaped the development of Persian, Urdu, and Andalusian poetry after Islam spread. The Arabs, after Islam, kept the tradition alive as the tribal structures were still there, and a little later in the 8th century, the Quranic exegesis took up poetry in their research. Abu Nawas is interesting because he's the same guy, if I'm not mistaken. He made fun of the romantic prelude, the Nasib. He actually mocked it. He says, while the wretched stands upon, and he did it in quite a good verse, by the way, like very, very good verse. While the wretched stands and cries over the ruins, wonders, while the wretched wanders around the ruins and cries, I wonder with my wine glass, blah blah blah. It's really nice. He's basically mocking and saying, come on, man, is this what it's all about? And this is when change happens, when you start to do this. I learned this today from, I was watching a document, like a lecture on by a researcher on poetry. She's an Arab lady, and I've linked it in the description. You can watch that. It's quite good. So influence on Persian poetry, post-Islamic. Mariam, can we read, please?
Influence of Arabic poetry. Adoption of the Qasida. The Persian poetic tradition adopted the Qasida, the long monorhymed ode used for praise, madh, satire, hija, and lamentation, ghitha. Poets like Rudaki, 9th to 10th century, and Unsuri, 11th century, mastered this form. Development of ghazal. The ghazal, a short lyrical poem focused on love and mysticism, evolved from the nasib, romantic prelude of the Arabic qasida, use of Arabic vocabulary and imagery. Persian poetry integrated Arabic poetic diction, such as themes of the beloved, Habib, wine, khamar. Sorry.
Cool.
Okay. Yeah.
I'll read the rest then. So Persian poetic. So then they innovated. Obviously, the Persians. No way are the Persians going to allow the Arabs to change their culture. So the Persians then innovated, for example, such as in the Mathnavi. Unlike Arabic poetry, Persian poets developed the Mathnavi, a rhyming couplet form used for storytelling, e.g. Ferdowsi's Shahnameh and Rumi's Mathnavi. Mysticism and Sufism. While pre-Islamic Arabic poetry focused on tribal honor and worldly themes, Persian poets like Rumi, Hafiz, and Attar infused poetry with Sufi spiritual themes influenced by both Arabic and indigenous Persian traditions. Key examples: Ferdowsi in Shahnameh used Arabic poetic techniques while preserving Persian historical and mythical narratives. Urdu poetry. Can we have Safran read, please?
Influence of Arabic and Persian poetry. Qasida and Ghazal tradition. Urdu inherited the Qasida, used for praise, and the Ghazal, used for love and Sufi themes, from Arabic and Persian poetry, merging Arabic, Persian, and Indic elements. Urdu developed in South Asia under Persian influence, incorporating Arabic poetic structures but also borrowing from local Indian traditions. Takhallus. The Arabic practice of poets using a pen name at the end of a ghazal was adopted in Urdu. Urdu poetic innovation, rector style. A blend of Persianized Urdu and Arabic poetic diction became prominent in Ghalib's and Mir Taqi Mir's poetry. Marsiya, a form of elegiac poetry used to mourn the tragedy of Karbala, derived from Arabic traditions of Rithah. Key example: Mirza Ghalib, 1797 to 1869, used Arabic-style metaphors in his Urdu ghazals while deepening the themes of loss, love, and philosophy.
Thank you, well done. So Andalusian poetry, I'll read this. So the influence of pre-Islamic Arabic poetry, I think I've linked, or if I've not linked, actually I haven't linked, but I have a lecture as well on Andalusian poetry. I'll probably link that as well. Courtly poetry and qasida. Arabic poets in Al-Andalus continued the qasida tradition, praising rulers and celebrating love and nature. Adoption of love poetry inspired by the nasib of the Arabic qasida. Andalusian poets developed romantic and nature-focused poetry. Andalusian poetic innovation. Muwashsha. Muwash, a new poetic form unique to Al-Andalus. The Muwash blended Arabic, Berber, and local Iberian influences. It often included a closing stanza in colloquial Spanish or Mozo-Arabic. Zajl, a popular poetic form that mixed classical Arabic with local dialects, later influencing Spanish poetry and music. Key examples: Ibn Hazm wrote The Ring of the Dove, a book on love influenced by Arabic poetic traditions. Ibn Guzman perfected the Zajl, a sung poetry form that later influenced Spanish folk traditions. So this is a completely different style compared to what we're used to, because we all come from a Persia Urdu kind of a tradition. So this is something that everybody should look into, myself including. This seems like something totally different than what we're used to. So examples, let's have a look. So this is how it was in the traditional poems, and this is what other people did. So can we have Shahid read the left side, please? Well, I'll read the left side, you can read the right side. So the Arabic Qasida of Imrul Qais, this is the one that we keep using the same line and again, because this is the one he's very famous for, and there's not much there in English anyway. So one of the most famous pre-Islamic poets, Imrul Qais, composed a legendary Qasida in his Mu'allaqat, a collection of pre-Islamic odes. The opening lines are an example of the nasib, where the poet warns his lost love. Let me try to do this in the style of the whatever style of poem this is. كفى نبكي من ذكرى حبيبي ومنزلي بصدق اللحظة بين الدخول فحوملي. Stop, let us weep over the memory of a beloved and her abandoned dwelling at the edge of the desert between Dakhul and Hamwal. So the key features we all know now. This is a romantic prelude, the campsite, the longing, desert imagery, and mono, rhyme, and meter. If I read it properly, you would have heard that. So the Persian adaptation by Rodaki. Can we have Shahid reading it, please? Actually, you know what?
Persian,
Sorry. I'm going to get Mariam to read because it's Persian there. I'm sure she can read the Persian.
Persian adaptation, Rudaki, 9th to 10th century. Persian poets adopted the Qasida format but infused it with Persian mysticism and courtly themes. Rudaki, one of the earliest Persian poets, wrote a Qasida with a similar opening of nostalgia and longing. I assumed in Boston. So it says, Bui jui mulyan ayat hama, yadi yage mehraban ayat hama. The scent of the Mulyan stream comes to me, bringing memories of my kind-hearted beloved.
I think this is the same meter, right? So Persian, instead of harsh desert landscapes, he evokes lush gardens. So you can see the difference straight away. You know, Persia has a lot of greenery to it as well, and they have the advantage of describing that. And it's more musical and flowy. The minute you read that, I sensed that. Persian Qasidas become softer in tone, reflecting Persian aesthetics, Sufism and philosophy. Later Persian poets like Rumi, Hafiz used the Qasida format for spiritual love. If any of you have read the Mathnavi, it's very, very, very long, right? And you could do so much with that. So Shahid, do you want to read the Urdu one, please?
by the time Urdu poetry developed, the Qasida had transformed into a more personal and philosophical expression. Ghalib, one of the greatest Urdu poets, wrote, Bhi nai tahi bimari fasad kam wasali yar boot agar aur jate rehte te antatar hota. It was never in my fate to unite with my beloved. Had I lived longer, I would have been the same endless wait.
So you can see in all three poems, this is the Arabic, pre-Islamic Arabic nasib shining through. So more introspective, Urdu poetry becomes deeply personal and existential, philosophical and emotional. Instead of just longing for love, Ghalib reflects on fate and the cruelty of time. Influence of Persian mysticism, like Persian poets, Urdu poems linked love with divine longing. So pre-Islamic poetry and its significance in the Quranic exegesis. The most reliable source on pre-Islamic Arabia is the Qur'an. We know this. And after the Qur'an, it's the poetry. The existence of poetic discourse in pre-Islamic Arabian society is attested in the Qur'an. The Qur'an had a problem with poetry. Why? Can you tell me why the Qur'an had a problem with poetry? Or pre-Islamic poetry? Could somebody tell me? Come on, students. We should know this by now.
Was it because of the content of the poetry?
Because of the content, and when we say content, we just think the lewdness. But outside of the lewdness, the content such as fakhr, boasting, such as lampooning, satire, all of this stuff. And even when it talks about good things, it's not stuff that the Arabs would do. They would talk about it, but they wouldn't practice it. So the Quran and poetry. Mariam, do you want to read this? This is the Quranic ayah.
Shall I inform you upon whom the devils descend? They descend upon every sinful liar. They pass on what is heard, but most of them are liars. And the poets, the deviators, follow them. Do you not see that they wander senselessly in every valley, and that they say what they do not do, except those poets who believe and do righteous deeds and remember Allah often and defend Islam after they were wronged? And those who have wronged are going to know to what kind of return they will be returned.
Excellent. So the first three lines, shall I inform you upon whom the devils descend? This is to do with the soothsayers, the kahins, the ones that prophesize. So Allah is talking about how the devils descend upon them and then they lie, and then what the soothsayers tell you is one bit truth with 100 lies. They pass on what is heard, but most of them are liars. This is the jinn that pass on the information. And then Allah turns to the poets. So you see how Allah's joined two themes together? The soothsayers and the poets. The poets are a little better. The deviators follow only the deviators, people who've got nothing better to do in life, like this sort of revelry and stuff. It's like you can imagine people that go to bars and, like, you know, Wild West, those kind of drinking holes where you just sit and play cards, and, you know, cowboys walk in and there's a bar fight and more drinking and women and, you know, just song, and here it would be poetry. It just carries on. Do you not see that they wander senselessly in every valley? This is imagery. This is to do with they touch upon so many different genres, but they say what they do not do. So they'll talk about this topic, and this topic, and all of these topics, but they don't do anything of it. And then Allah says, and we did not teach him the Prophet poetry, nor is it befitting for him. It is not but a message and a clear Qur'an. Or do they say he is a poet for whom we await a misfortune of time? So not all poetry was condemned. Aisha, can you read, please?
Hassan ibn Thabit was known as the poet of the Prophet ﷺ, defending Islam and responding to the attacks of Quraysh poets. His poetry is in the classical Arabic qasida form and follows traditional pre-Islamic meters. Should I read the Arabic, Ustad?
Yeah, if you can, yeah.
One of the most famous lines in praise of the Prophet ﷺ, وَأَحْسَنُ مِنْكَ لم ترى قط عن عيني وأجمل منك لم تلد النساء خلقت مبرأ من كل عيب كأنك قد خلقت كما تشاء. My eyes have never seen anyone more perfect than you. No woman has given birth to anyone more beautiful than you. You were created free from all defects, as if you were created exactly as you wished. Meter al-Basit. This poem follows al-Basit meter, a common classical Arabic meter. Am I saying it right? Meter.
Yeah, meter.
Known for its balanced rhythm, meter pattern. It has a flowing and balanced structure, often used for praise and eulogies.
So this is mustaf'alun, fa'alun, mustaf'alun, fa'alun. This is the meter. We'll have a look at all of the meters later on, inshallah. It has a flowing and balanced structure, often used for praise and eulogies. This poem is what you all need to memorize, by the way. Yeah, have you heard this poem before?
Yes.
Yes.
Right. The last line. Do you remember we saw the statement of the companions where they in the epigraphic writing in early Arabic, three of the companions of Rasulullah signed off something, and they said with Allah, and then they mentioned something about Rasulullah that would have been problematic for the Wahhabis, right? Do you remember we had a brief look at that? Do you remember? You've all forgotten. Right, so here there's something else now. كَأَنَّكَ قَدْ خُلِقَتْ كَمَا تَشَاءُ. Right, so you were created as if the way you wanted. So he's saying that, you know, it's as if Allah created you, O Habib, the way you wanted. Not the other way around, but Allah did what you wanted. However you wanted to be created, Allah created you. Now this would have many a Wahhabi turning in their grave. Can you see why?
Yes.
Yeah, but this is coming from the mouth of a companion of Rasulullah in front of him. Right? So there's no problem, and there's no shirk, and there's nothing in this. This is a poem that we need to remember, inshallah. So this is a second companion who was also a poet. He sang the famous qasida Banat Su'ad. Who can read this one? Safran.
Qab ibn Zuhair, Qasida Banat Suad. Qab ibn Zuhair was originally an enemy of Islam. However, after the conquest of Makkah, he repented and presented his poem to Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, who forgave him and rewarded him with his own cloak, making this poem legendary in Islamic history. Meter al-Kamil. This poem follows al-Kamil, a robust meter often used in war poetry, praise, and heroic themes. Meter pattern.
Don't worry about that.
This meter,
Yeah.
okay. This meter gives the poem a rhythmic and powerful flow, making it ideal for dramatic themes. Suad has departed, and today my heart is wounded, enslaved by love for her, shackled with no escape. This poem follows the classic qasida structure, nasib, nostalgic prelude. The poet begins with longing for his beloved, rihla, journey section, descriptions of the desert and hardships of travel, madih, praise. God praises the Prophet Muhammad, seeking his mercy.
Subhanallah. So he's used the same pre-Islamic model to craft a poem on Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, right? And Suad has departed, and today my heart is wounded. This is to do with his wife, right? Praise of the Prophet in the same qasida. Indeed, the messenger is a light that people seek guidance from, a sharp Indian sword amongst the swords of the Arabs. Hassan ibn Thabit, another companion, he's praised for Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Have I made a mistake here? No, I haven't. Yeah, it's the same poem. His poetry was so valued that Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam prayed for him, saying, "Oh Allah, support him with the Holy Spirit." This is the full poem here, right? So, my eyes have never seen anyone more perfect than you. No woman has given birth to anyone more beautiful than you. You were created free from all defects, as if you were created exactly as you wished. Muhammad is the man whom all people seek refuge with in times of hardship and great distress. If you are asked to choose between him and another person, then choose him and leave the rest of mankind. You see the line here, Muhammad is the man whom all people seek refuge with. That's something else that the Wahhabis would have a problem with, but if it's coming from the mouth of Hassan ibn Thabit. So where's the problem? Ka'ab ibn Zuhair, his qasida. So this is the opening here, right? So Suad has departed, and today my heart is wounded, enslaved by love for her, shackled with no escape. So he's mentioning this in front of Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, by the way, right? But the meaning is something else. So that's why Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam probably didn't censor him. Suad on the morning of separation as they departed was but a doe-eyed beauty, her lashes dark with kohal. The camel moves forward, slicing through the... So this is the rahil now. The camel moves forward, slicing through the darkness like a saw cutting through a locked door. She walks the valleys and under the mountains like a man carefully stepping over a shallow stream. This is the main meaning now. Indeed, the messenger is a light that people seek guidance from, a sharp Indian sword amongst the swords of Allah. He is amongst the noble youth of Quraysh, and it was said of them... Sorry, I got something in the way of my screen. It was said of them, in the heart of Mecca, when they submitted to Islam, they became honored. So here is a poem. You can clearly see he's got all three parts of the poem. When you write your poem, by the way, this is what you need to do. So you need to have an opening, you need to have a journey, and then you need to have the main part of the thing, which here would be a praise, a panegyric, or whatever they call it. I'll give you an example of this in the text, inshallah, when I text you. Right, so the meters, this poem, which he mentioned, follows the Al-Kamil meter, which has the pattern. I had a look at these. If you don't look at them with the i'rab, you get them wrong. So I remember looking at them with the i'rab. Mutafa'alan, mutafa'alan, mutafa'alan. This meter is bold, rhythmic, and dramatic, making it perfect for heroic themes. Let's see what it is here. Banat su'adu faqalbi al-yawma matbulu. Watayyim إثرها لم يقد مقبول وما سعاد غدا ذلين إذا رحلوا إلا أرضا كيد التركين مقبول. Okay, yeah, so there's the meter there in action. I still don't get it properly, but it's there anyway. So Hassan ibn Thabit, his poem was in praise of the Prophet. Ka'b ibn Duhair, Qasida, Banat Su'ad, different meters. One is smooth flowing praise, the other one is dramatic apology and praise. Hassan ibn Thabit's poetry was entirely in praise of Islam and the Prophet, written in Al-Basit meter, which gives it an elegant and smooth rhythm. Ka'b ibn Zubair's poem started as a love and journey qasida but ended with praise of the Prophet, written in Al-Kamil, which gives it a bold and rhythmic style. Both poets were directly connected to the Prophet, and their poetry played a role in early Islamic history. So it's a good idea to have a look at these poems and study these poems with somebody to find out the differences in style and everything. This is where the beauty comes through of pre-Islamic poetry now. Shahid, do you want to read?
Poetry and the Prophet. Amr bin Sharid reported his father as saying, "One day when I rode behind Allah's Messenger, Allah bless him and grant him peace, he said to me, 'Do you remember any poetry of Umayyah bin Abi Sa'id?' Salt. I said, 'Yes.' He, Allah bless him and grant him peace, said, 'Then go on.' I recited a couplet, and he, Allah bless him and grant him peace, said, 'Go on.' Then again I recited a couplet, and he, Allah bless him and grant him peace, said, 'Go on.' I recited 100 couplets of his poetry.
Carry on reading all of it, please.
The truest words spoken by a poet were the words of the pre-Islamic poet Labid. He said, 'Lo, everything apart from Allah is vanity and falsehood. Truly, in some poetry there is wisdom.' Bukhari. In other version, the Prophet, Allah bless him and grant him peace, even mentioned that the poet Umayyah bin Abi Salt was almost a Muslim in his poetry.
SubhanAllah. So for those people that say that Islam is against poetry, here you can see the words of the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And when he says Umayyah bin Abi Salt was almost a Muslim in his poetry, this is because his poetry is monotheist. You know, he's talking almost like a Muslim would talk. And he's asking to listen to poetry. Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam would not want to hear pre-Islamic poetry. It wasn't something worthy of his blessed ears. But the poetry of Umayyah bin Abi Salt would remind him of Allah. It had hikmah in there, wisdom in there, probably aphorisms, something that everybody can benefit. So he said, okay, tell me what he said. Because the Prophet wouldn't memorize these things for himself. So he would say to him, okay, tell me what he said. Safran, do you want to read?
Did the Prophet, Allah bless him and grant him peace, ever recite poetry himself? At times the Prophet, Allah bless him and grant him peace, himself would cite poetry that others wrote, such as when he was helping to dig the trench in the Battle of Khandaq with a stone tied to his abdomen to allay hunger pains, his blessed body covered in dust, while carrying loads of dirt in service of his brethren. He would recite a poem written by Abdullah ibn Rawaha, may Allah be pleased with him. O Allah, were it not for you, we would not have been guided, nor would we have given charity, nor prayed. So bestow on us calmness.
So this is the poem that Rasul recited as he was helping them dig the trench of Khandaq. And this is also the time where there was a big rock that was in the way, and the Sahaba tried to knock the rock aside, but they couldn't. So Rasul came and used his pickaxe, and he struck it once, and sparks flew off in the direction of Syria. And then second time, and sparks flew off in the direction of Persia. And then the third time, the companion said, "This is something very strange. We've never seen this before. What's this?" And then he mentioned the symbolism of what those sparks meant. All of this happened at the same time. It should be noted, however, that these times were not common, and he was not a poet himself, because this is a fatwa taken from Seeker's Guidance, by the way. I'm just reading the fatwa. And he was not a poet himself because he, Allah bless him and grant him peace, was sent with the Qur'an, the words of Allah Ta'ala, and though his enemies accused him of being a poet, Allah Most High absolved him of this false accusation when he said, "And we have not taught him poetry, nor is it appropriate for him." Abu Sa'ud in his tafsir mentions that not only was composing poetry unbefitting for the Prophet, but that even the ability to write poetry wasn't part of his makeup. And to prove this conclusively, Allah made him unlettered, unlike the poets. Ibn Kathir says he ﷺ, didn't memorize a single complete stanza of poetry on its exact meter, and whenever he recited something, he would either not complete the stanza or transpose some of the words. Abu Sa'ud notes that in the rare times when the Rasul ﷺ did seem to recite a new couplet, he was simply speaking without intending to rhyme, and the words only seemed like poetry. Still, any word that he spoke was more beautiful than the best poetry. So this is what he's talking about here, is when there was a young boy who his bird died. So Rasulullah said to the bird, "Oh young boy, what about your bird?" And it actually rhymed perfectly. But he was just speaking normally, but it just happened to rhyme in how a poem would rhyme. This is what's being mentioned here. So the poets amongst the companions, can we have Shahid read, please?
The poets among the companions, out of his companions, may Allah be pleased with them, four were particularly well known for reciting poetry: Abdullah ibn Rawaha, Ka'b ibn Malik, Ka'b ibn Zuhair, and Hassan ibn Thabit. Allah Most High said in Surah of Al-Shu'ara, the poets, regarding the poets from amongst the pagans: as for the poets, the ones who are astray, follow them closely. Don't you see how they wander about in every valley, crossing the limits of praise and disparagement? And they say that which they do not practice. At this, Ibn Kathir and Imam al-Tabari relate that some of the above companion poets became worried that the verse was speaking about them. Then Allah Ta'ala revealed the next verse, which made an exception for the Muslim poets, saying, "Except for those poets who believe and do righteous deeds and remember Allah much, and come to the aid of the Muslims by composing verses against those who lampoon them."
Thank you. In fact, the Prophet set up another. By the way, I'm not saying peace be upon him, because when you're talking or reading and you mention the name many times, you can just say it once and it covers everything, just in case somebody thinks that I lack manners. In fact, Rasulullah set up another pulpit in his mosque so that Hassan ibn Thabit could recite his poetry from it, either in praise of the Prophet or to satirize the Quraysh. In those times, enemies would lampoon another tribe through verse to show their superiority over them, to ridicule the other side in the public's eye, and to increase the valor of their own people against the opposing tribe, an ancient form of propaganda. Thus, when the Quraysh began to versify their antagonism towards the Muslims, the Prophet said to Hassan, "Lampoon them, and Jibreel is with you." Hassan would then recite poetry in the mosque that would praise the Prophet and the two main groups of Muslims, namely the immigrants and the helpers, even many years later. These companions were actually using poetic skills that they had before their acceptance of Islam. They often, after they became Muslim, they changed the subject matter and began to use their talents solely for the sake of Allah, which is especially relevant for young Muslim artists today. This is the actual fatwa taken from Seeker's guidance. This is the fatwa carrying on. So can we have Mariam read, please?
Poetry should not be offensive nor distract from one's duties. This is not to say that poetry does not have its limits. When the Prophet ﷺ said, "It is better for a man's belly to be stuffed with pus, which corrodes it, than to stuff one's mind with frivolous poetry," what was intended with poetry whose subject matter is not wholesome nor conducive to the remembrance of Allah, or it distracts the listener from their duties as a Muslim, such as reciting religious poems all night but forgetting to say the Isha prayer, or missing one's Fajr, or poetry which makes one unlawfully angry or lustful. Imam Muslim narrates that Abu Ubaid said, on the face of it, this means that one's heart is filled until it busies him from the Qur'an and the remembrance of Allah. But if the Qur'an and the remembrance of Allah are dominant in him, then to us this person is not stuffed full with poetry. Also, poetry should not insult anyone's lineage or backbite, nor be lewd or profane, nor describe specific women, nor praise things which in themselves are not good and beneficial. It should also not become one's obsession that detracts from one's worldly duties, nor put one in the wrong company or places.
So this sounds a bit strange to us now. It shouldn't distract people and become the obsession of their life. But in the past, poetry played that role. Today, we would say people listening to music, rap music, hip hop music would kind of fit that understanding, and being like a videophile, filmophile, which someone addicted to watching movies. Pre-Islamic Jahili poetry and its role in preserving Arabic. One exception to wholesome poetry is pre-Islamic Jahili poetry, which was full of the mention of many immoral things along with noble things as well. The Arabic used in these poems was the purest, and in the absence of a recorded system of language, those poems preserved and became references for the rules of grammar, meanings and usages of Arabic words, which in turn allowed the Muslims to understand the Qur'an and preserve religious teachings. For this reason, Ibn Abidin mentions in his Hashiyah that they pre-Islamic and early Muslim poets till the year 150 Hijri were who they were experts in their eloquent rhetoric and pure style, and knowledge of their poetry is transmission and knowledge of the religion itself, and memorizing those poems is a collective obligation, fard kifaya, according to the scholars of Islam, because by it the rules of Arabic are established, by which the book and the sunnah are understood, upon which religious rulings are dependent, through which the lawful is discerned from the unlawful. Their poetry, though it can admit of moral shortcomings in its meanings, does not admit to mistakes in its word usage and sentence structures. So subhanallah, it becomes fard kifaya to learn some lewd poetry just to preserve the religion. Interesting. You keep thinking lewd poetry. We haven't seen much examples of lewd poetry, but trust me, if you look further, you'll start to see it. I just don't want to post it. Khalifa Umar in Al-Badawi records Umar saying, "O people, keep looking after your diwan. You will not be misled." People asked, "What is our diwan?" Umar said, "Pre-Islamic poetry, since it holds the interpretation of your book as well as the meanings of your discourse." As-Suyuti says, "If you want to understand the rare expressions of the Qur'an, Gharib al-Qur'an, look them up in the pre-Islamic poetry, since this poetry is in fact the diwan of the Arabs." The legal rulings of the scholars with regard to poetry. Safran, please.
Ibn Abidin continues by commenting on what is disliked makruh of the poetry of the Muwallideen, those poets who lived after 150 Hijri, with the exception of Imam al-Shafi, when they wrote about infatuation, whether describing a specific woman or the meeting of lovers, or love sickness and passion, or other idle matters. He says that the disliked kind of poetry is perhaps what is continuously engaged in, and when it is made into a kind of profession to the point where it overcomes one and busies him from the remembrance of Allah and religious sciences, and that it is how the hadith against frivolous poetry mentioned above is interpreted. So there is no harm in a little of it, if one intends bringing up anecdotes, subtle niceties, high metaphors, and noble meanings, even if there is the description of cheeks and physiques, because the scholars of metaphoric writing would use later poets' writings as references for those very reasons. And Ibn al-Hammam mentioned that the unlawful part of poetry is those words themselves that are unlawful to use, like describing private areas or specific living women, or describing intoxicants in arousing ways, or bars and clubs, or disparaging a Muslim or non-Muslim member of society if the speaker intends to disparage them. So there's no reason to forbid poetry altogether. Yes, if it is regarding one who is wasting time without benefit, then he is forbidden, even if the poems had good counsel and wisdom. Ibn Abidin Rad al-Muhtar ala Dar al-Mukhtar. Poetry is at the same status as ordinary speech. The good of it poetry is like the good of speech, and the despised of it is like what is despised of speech. Bukhari Adab al-Mufrad
Okay, this is
from a fatwa.
this is a
Seeker's
fatwa
Guidance.
from Seeker's Guidance by Abdullah Anik Misra, who I consider one of my teachers. Okay, so a word on poetic meter. The Bihar is Buhar is the plural of ocean or sea. There were about 16 meters that the Arabs would compose their poetry on, and it would only be kept within those 16. And that's what made the poetry so unique. At that time in history, other countries, other empires, countries is not the right word, other cultures, other empires would have free verse poetry. So it wouldn't be constrained like this. And this is what gave Arabic the edge, in my opinion, when it came to language development. Because to constrict yourself in using verse and to fit everything you want to say in verse is absolutely amazing. But what makes it even more amazing is if you don't really have much inspiration. The Arabian desert, what inspiration can you get from there? The sky, the sand, the heat, the camel, the sword, the horse. That's it. What can you say? So you have to come out with novel ways to present your poetry, and they have to fit the bahar. They have to fit the bahar, and you have to start to use more and more archaic words, and those words have to fit the bahar as well. So it's forcing you to use extreme words to fit the bahar with limited simile and metaphor, which is something truly amazing in pre-Islamic poetry, if you've understood what I just said. So Al-Khalil ibn Ahmad categorizes Arabic poetry into 16 buhur, each with its own rhythm of long and short syllables. These buhur define how a line of poetry is structured. So these are the buhur. So can we have Aisha reading one side and Rumesa reading the other side, please?
The 16 buhur oceans of Arabic poetry. طاويل, the long. فعولنا مفاعلين. Sorry, I'm not gonna butcher that. Oh, okay, so sorry.
You know, I made the same mistake. I made the same mistake. I would have read the same thing as you, but when I had to look at the transliteration, that's when I realized that they're all on a different scale, than the different way than we would read them.
So فعولنا مفاعلنا used in heroic and grand poetry.
I was thinking when I read the first one, and I deliberately read it, I'm thinking, oh my God, they're thinking he doesn't know how to read Arabic without Arab. That's because I'd seen how it was in transliteration, so I read it correctly. But had I not seen it, I would have read it wrong as well. Okay, cool. So used in heroic and grand poetry.
البسيط, the extended, فاعل, used in storytelling and praise poetry. الكامل, the perfect. متفاعل, flexible, used in a variety of contexts.
Nice, thank you. Rumesa, please.
الوافر, the abundant. مفاعلة فاعل, used for emotional and lyrical poetry. الرجز, the trembling. مستفعل, the simplest meter, often used for proverbs and didactic poetry. الرمل, the sand. فاعلات, suited for melancholic and reflective themes.
Good, excellent, well done. Can we have Shahid and Safran, please?
7. Kafit, the light. Fa'itun, mustafilun, fa'ilatun, used in both serious and light-hearted poetry. 8. Sari, the swift. Mustafilun, muf'ulatun, a rapid energetic meter. 9. Munsari, the running. Mustafilun maf'ulatun mufta'ilun, a lively dynamic meter.
Safran.
Number 10, mujtath, the snatched. Mustafilun, fa'ilatun, used in more intricate poetic compositions. 11, mutadarik, the accelerated. Fa'ilun, the most modern sounding meter, often associated with new poetry. 12, mutakarib, the close. Fa'ulun, used for heroic and war poetry.
Excellent. So can we have Aisha and Rumesa finish it off, please?
المديد, the prolonged. فاعلات, rarely used, has a soft and musical rhythm. المجثث, the shortened, some name as number 10 but different structure. مستفعلون فاعلات, a light and elegant meter.
الهزج, the chanting. مفاعيلا, used in song-like rhythmic poetry. المقتضب, the abridged. مفعولات مستفعل, a quick-paced clipped meter.
They say that the Arabs got this from when they were walking in the desert, and you have your camel, and your camel is sorry, my electricity is gone. Just let me get a torch. Can you hear me, by the way? Resuming, it's resuming again. Can you see my screen? Probably not.
No.
So where is the whole screen business? Can you see my screen now, everybody? Can you see my screen, everybody? Yeah.
It's loading for me.
Loading.
Yes.
We're in. We're in. Let's go. How do I make this big? Yep, there you go. Okay, so we were on this one. Did we do it? Let's just assume we've done it. How these meters work. Each bahar consists of 2 hemistitches. If I had time, I would have gone more into poetry and discussed the A and all that business, but didn't have time, unfortunately. Each bahar consists of 2 hemistitches, which is the left and right. So it's the 2 parts of the poem, which you see it in all Arabic poetry, even when you learn the Islamic stuff, like Al-Jawhara of Imam Laqani or Al-Baykuniya or Ajramiyya doesn't really work that way, but it's the same thing, the 2 hemistitches on left and right. And the poets have to adhere strictly to the meter throughout the poem. The pattern could be modified to create variations, but the core structure remained intact. So here we can see, if we look at Imrul Qais's poem, right at the beginning, this is what I struggled a bit to understand, actually. كفى نبكي من ذكرى حبيب ومنزلي. So this is supposed to be on فعولا مفاعل فعولا مفاعل. See, oh my God, see, I'm making the same mistake again. مفاعل 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 مفاعل. Right, okay. Can someone see how this works? كفى نبكي من ذكرى حبيب ومنزلي. كفى. Can somebody see it? No, nobody can see. Safran, can you?
What are you asking about the fa'ulun, mafa'ilun?
Yeah, so the actual the meter, the poetic meter, how it's being used in كفى نبكي من ذكرى حبيب ومنزلي. There's a breakdown of it here. Here there's a breakdown of it.
No
Yeah,
problem.
so scanning
Yeah.
Imrul Qais line, let's break down the first hemistitch. So كفى نبكي من ذكرى فعول مفاعل فعول. See, I don't get this. Anybody following this?
I think it's a breakdown of the syllables. The table does help to make it a bit more
No, I'm not
clearer.
talking about tables. If you see at the top in the blue, the first line of the poem, and then it should be on the wazn underneath, but it doesn't. I don't see how it's on the wazn. Kifa is like the kifa is doesn't seem like it's on fa'ulun.
I think it's not so much to do with the sarf. I think it's talking about syllables. But I could be
كفى
wrong.
نبكي من ذكرى فعول مفاعل. How?
I don't know. This is how it sounds to me. So qifa, fa'u, and then the lun would be nebki. So like
How
fa'ulun.
are you getting the lun to be nabki?
I don't know, but it's just in my head. It's fitting in like that. But I always found this topic confusing.
Yeah, so that's it. It's difficult. It's very difficult. You might notice that the last foot mafa'il instead of mafa'ilun is slightly shortened. This is due to dhihaf and illa, which allows variation in classic poetry. Oh, okay. I don't get that. Let's move on. So what about the Qur'an? What's the Qur'an? Okay, I was supposed to put this properly as well, so because I didn't do it, I don't want you seeing the answers. So tell me about the Qur'an. Is the Qur'an poetry? People, is the Qur'an poetry? Come on, everybody. Is the Qur'an poetry? Yes or no?
No.
Why do you say that?
It's more of a law.
Okay, well, قل أعوذ برب الناس مالك الناس إله الناس من شر الوسواس الخناس. Does that not sound like poetry to you?
It has elements, but obviously you can't just call it overall. We wouldn't say it's poetry. It's just more than that. If
Okay, is
that
it
makes
prose?
sense. Prose, probably.
But how is it prose when every verse I read ended in the same ending rhyme? Prose is just like human speech, and human speech doesn't rhyme when you speak it.
Okay. Then it wouldn't be prose then.
Shahid, what do you think?
I think it's a pure and high form of Arabic.
That's true. That's true, but is that pure and high form poetry or prose?
A mixture.
Mixture.
Can it be a mixture?
Yes, it can be. Well done. Actually, it is. Let's have a look.
All right.
Is the Quran poetry? No, the Quran is not considered poetry in the classical Arabic sense. Here's why. What happened here? Why is it doing this? Poetry in Arabic follows strict metrical patterns, arud, such as ta'wil, basit, or kamil. The Quran does not conform to any of these known metrical systems. Rasul ﷺ explicitly denied being a poet. and we did not teach him poetry, nor is it befitting for him. Is the Qur'an prose? Not exactly. Classical Arabic prose falls into two broad categories. Rhymed prose, sajja, a rhythmic rhyming form used by soothsayers. Straightforward prose, nathar, plain unrhymed speech like historical writing. So historical writing, we know what that is. Soothsayers would speak in a way, so when you go to a soothsayer, a jinni would overcome them, and they would pass on the knowledge in a rhyming way of speaking. So the only way I could say that is when you rap. You know when rappers rap, and they stress some syllables, and then the last syllable is always kind of the same or something like this. This is the way that these kahinas, these soothsayers, fortune tellers would speak when the jinn would overcome them. The Quran is not exactly that, and it's not exactly poetry. Does the Quran use saj'a, rhyming prose? Yes, parts of the Quran use rhymed prose, but with a key difference. By the way, this is a surface level touch on this subject now. I'm not an expert on this, right? I don't have the skills to delve deeper. This is just a surface level touch. If you want to take this further, you can read I'jazul Quran and everything about that subject to know exactly where it differs and how it differs. But to understand how it differs, one needs to understand pre-Islamic poetry as well. Yes, parts of the Quran do use rhyming prose. Normal sajja has fixed rhythmic patterns and often sounds artificial. The Quran, however, has a much more fluid structure, combining rhythm but not rigid meter, rhyme but not predictable like sajja, variation in sentence length and structure. So while the Quran shares some features with sajja, it is more dynamic and less formulaic. Is the Quran something in between? Yes, the Quran occupies a unique middle ground. It's divine speech. It is neither poetry nor conventional prose, but something distinct. It blends rhythm and rhyme, powerful imagery and rhetorical devices. There's a whole list of rhetorical devices. I didn't have time to put them there. And even if I did, some of them just look alien to me. So there's no point just putting them there if you can't explain them. But I'll give you the source where I got it from, and you can read up everything there yourself. Structural variations that defy poetic meter. So let's say there was no pre-Islamic poetry. The Quran comes down. The Quran looks like somebody was trying to recite poetry, and in some places it's like poetry, and in other places it's like sajja, right? It's not poetry, it's just like rhyming prose. Okay, where's the big deal? The big deal is that wasn't the convention that the pre-Islamic Arabs used literature in. We discussed that for them it wasn't architecture, wasn't music, wasn't painting, it was just poetry. And poetry was bound by strict conventions. If I was living in pre-Islamic Arabia and I wanted to be a poet and I started to produce nonsensical or poorly written poetry, I would get slapped in the back of the head 1,000,000 times and rubbished, right? And the nose of my tribe would have been cut off, if you know what that expression means. Poetry needed to be in this beautiful fixed way, which made it so difficult to write. And that is literature for the Arabs, and that's what they measure everything against. If you cannot write like that, don't write. If you cannot speak like that, poetry, don't speak, basically. So when the Quran comes and all of a sudden it's in different conventions, no, you cannot then say this is poor poetry, or this is the Quran trying to be poetry, but it can't be, which is what Orientalists like to say, by the way, that it's poor poetry, or it's trying to mix and match. Where Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, couldn't get the poetry correct, he ended up using rhyming prose, sajja, right? This is the argument that the Orientalists use, or the attacks against Islam use. But somebody who knows their sciences, arud, and who knows how poetry works, and who knows the strict conventions, and not just the strict conventions, they know the place of poetry in ancient Arabia. We studied it right now. So you've seen how important it is, right? The first person, not the third person, and the importance of poetry. If you open your mouth and it's not poetry, then it's better keep your mouth shut, kind of thing. So when the Qur'an comes, the poets know straight away something is happening. Just like when Moses went to Pharaoh and he threw his staff, the magicians threw their staff and Moses threw his staff, and for everybody looking, they're seeing snakes from the magicians, and they're seeing a snake from Musa alayhi salam. They're thinking one magician and another magician. But the magicians knew exactly what was going on. They were like, no, this is not trickery. We are doing trickery, but what Moses is doing is something different. And then obviously Pharaoh punished them. He said, are you going to repent or should I punish you? And then you see whose punishment is the most severe. Likewise, when Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is coming with the Qur'an, someone like you and me cannot understand what's happening here. Even with when I try to research it, it's very difficult for me to understand what's exactly going on. But I just understood that the more you study poetry and the more you study the literary devices in the Qur'an, then you'll get a true appreciation and understanding of it. And those literary devices, I didn't really have time to put down, but some of them I'll read from the book for you. Are you following what I'm saying, everybody?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So, is the Quran something in between? Yes, the Quran occupies a unique middle ground. Classical Arabic poets and linguists were amazed by its style, admitting that it was unlike any poetry or prose they knew. This is why the Quran challenges people, then produce a chapter like it. Even expert poets of the time could not replicate it. And now you're thinking, how is that possible? You know, when there's an ayah that says, Alam tara kayfa, I could just say Alam tara kayfa and Alam tara kayfa fa'ala rabbuka bi ashabil fil. And then when Allah says how He dealt with the people of Al-Fil, I could make up an ayah and say Alam tara kayfa fa'ala rabbuka wa ashabul nas, or something like that. But people who know the stylistic way the Quran is speaking in a very high register of meaningful, purposeful language will straight away say the sentence that you made up looks like a copy of the Quran, but in no way is this the Quran. You know, when someone writes a letter, and if I were to cause Shahid the problem, I would write a letter to somebody and say written from Shahid. But somebody who knows Shahid very well will say this doesn't sound like him. Likewise, if Shahid is a singer and I write a fake song, or Shahid is a poet and I write a fake poem and I attribute it to Shahid, literary critics will say, hang on a minute, something is off about this poem. This doesn't sound like Shahid's hallmark, either stylistically or thematically. So likewise with the Quran, if you write something and it sounds like the Quran, people who know language, people who know Quran, people who know Arabian language, pre-Islamic high register of language, they're going to know this is off. And we'll see examples of this. And when we see the examples, maybe some of them we won't get, but people who are in the know, who know the language, the experts, they will straight away say something is amiss here. It's like when you get artists that make fake paintings. Chinese people can make beautiful copies of masterpieces and they sell them all the time. We're not talking about copies, photocopies, which you can also get, of masterpieces that are past their copyright. We're talking about hand-painted renditions of them. But a master will look at them and know from the brush strokes or the depth of the paint or the emotion that's gone into it, you know, where a particular part of the poem, the painting should have a happy vibe because of what's happening is happy. Are the brush strokes light? Yes, they're light, but are they flowing the way Van Gogh had them flowing or Monet had them flowing? No, there's a problem right here. You see the end streaks, they change a bit. Or when you look at something morose in the painting and it should be dark and deep and the colors are just slightly off, or the brush stroke, its end twitch is... Experts know this and they pull out these mistakes. Likewise with the Quran, if you try to do something like that, you will get caught. This is why when Allah says, then produce a chapter like it. They're not able to. Here's an example now we look at. So let's compare classical poetry with Quranic poetry before we look at some other things which are going to be surprising for you that I don't want to mention until we get there. So let's have the two girls. Let's have Aisha and Rumaisa, and then the key differences Shahid can read. So Imrul case is, let's read it Aisha, and Rumaisa read the surah.
Arabic poetry من القيس المعلقة قيفة نبكي من ذكري حبيب ومنزلي. Let us sweep over the memory of a beloved and a
Okay, one second. You made a mistake in your tashkil, by the way. I made the same mistake until I had to double check why. You read it right the first time you read it a few pages back, but this time you made a mistake in your Arabic reading. Can you have a guess which one it is?
Was
Yeah,
ذكري.
min dhikri. It should be min dhikra.
ذكرى, yeah.
I made the same mistake, by the way. Okay, so then the Quranic verse, Aisha, please.
Quranic verse Surah Alaq 96.
Okay, this is Rumaisa. This is Rumaisa, right?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
cool.
اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق الإنسان من علق. Read in the name of your Lord who created man from a clot of blood.
Okay, so on the left-hand side you have a poem which is clearly in one of the meters. And on the right-hand side you have the Qur'an which claims to be in no meter, not prose, not poem, but it clearly looks like poem. اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق الإنسان من علق. The last words are the same and they rhyme. So for superficially, people looking are going to say, well, this looks like poetry and that looks like poetry, and how is the Quran not poetry? But Shahid, please tell us the differences.
Number one, meter, arud. Poetry follows the strict tawil meter. Fa'ulun, mafa'ilun, fa'ulun, mafa'ilun. The Quran follows no fixed meter. Sentence lengths vary. Number two, rhyme, kafiyah. Poetry uses a fixed end rhyme across verses. The Quran uses fluid rhyme, where sounds shift naturally. Khalaq, alaq. 3. Sentence structure, nazm. Poetry follows complete grammatical sentences with clear subjects and predicates. The Quran more compressed, rhythmic, and elliptical, leaving deep meaning in short phrases. 4. Content and style. Poetry often is descriptive, personal, and emotional, weeping over lost love. The Quran commanding, direct, and universal, God's creation and human origin.
Excellent, well done. So these are the differences, and if you're still confused, we're going to build on these so they should get more and more clear. Can we have Shahid and Safran reading, please? Try to read the Arabic, even if you're not good at it, don't worry.
Okay. Rhymed prose, Saj of the Quran.
The Quhan Sajjad. So this is rhyming prose that the soothsayers we used to do. So it's no longer as strict as poetry. It's no longer on the poetic meters. It's just rhyming prose now, like rapping, if you can say.
Right. Rhyme prose. Akbil wala takhaf wa al baru wal baru kalla lay idha iza sajja. Come forward and do not fear. The sea is like the night when it covers all.
Okay, and Safran.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والضحى والليل إذا سجى ما ودعك ربك وما قلى. By the morning light and the night when it covers all, your Lord has not forsaken you nor has he despised you.
Shahid, you want to read?
The key differences here are one, the Saj, rhyme prose versus Quran. Both use rhyme, Saja and Kala. The Quran, however, adds deeper meaning and variation. Saj sounds more predictable and artificial, whereas the Quran has a naturally rhythmic flow. 2. Impact and meaning. The Saj is ornamental in style and poetic speech, whereas the Quran is more powerful, revelatory speech that conveys deep emotion and divine authority.
Okay, I only spent about a couple of hours on this, and straight away you start to get a feel for it. So on the left-hand side, come forward and do not fear. The sea is like the night when it covers all. It just sounds so nonsensical, right? You know, you can imagine this female witch doctor, female sorceress, the person's scared to come, and she's seducing them and saying, come, it's okay, come into me, you know, and then she's trying to show off her flamboyance. Come forward and do not fear. The sea is like the night when it covers all. It just sounds so nonsensical. Whereas the Quran, if both of them are using similar rhetorical styles, but look how deep the Quran on a surface level is deep. But when you go into the linguistics of it, it becomes even deeper. Just like the pre-Islamic poetry becomes deeper, this becomes deeper as well. By the morning light, what does that even mean? And the night when it covers all. Your Lord has not forsaken you, nor has he despised you. So when you go into the tafsir of the Quran, there are wonderful descriptions and unpackings of why Allah chose to use by the morning light. Because after all sadness is dark, right? After all sadness comes the day. See, I better be careful now. I shouldn't be translating the Quran, but this is what I understand. But I'm just saying is it's multi-level. Even though it's sajja, it's multi-level here. Whereas sajja here on the other side is just nonsensical. Poetry is multi-level, but here we're just comparing. If people say no, it's sajja, it's rhyming prose, then there's a huge difference in the way the Quran speaks and the way normal. And then the Arabs who knew would have picked up on this straight away and said, wow. You know, it's like when you say to be or not to be, that is the question. That's sajja. How would you say that in a better way? There's no other way to say that. That is the best way you can say that. Right? So likewise, when the Quran speaks, whatever's being said, the Arabs know that this is the best way to say it. They can't find a better way. Whereas with poetry or normal saj'a, you can find a better way of saying these things. Some poet will come along and say, well, you know, your word order for this one word was just wrong. It could have been done in another way. With the Quran, you can't break that. Okay, so that's the thing there. Why is the Quran unique? It's not poetry. It does not follow Arabic meters. It's not ordinary prose. It has rhyme, rhythm, and deep consciousness beyond rhymed prose. Unlike Saj'a, the Quran structure is natural, powerful, and unpredictable. This is why even expert poets of Quraysh could not replicate it, and why the Quran challenges them, then produce a chapter like it. فَأْتُوا بِسُورَةٍ مِّن مِثْلِهِ. Now we go on to one famous, infamous, idiotic, ridiculous, pathetic personality. Are you all familiar with this name here? Musaylama.
Yes.
Yes.
Have you ever read his revelations?
Yes.
Yeah, let's
Yes.
have a look at some of these stupid revelations now. Can we have the two girls? So one of you be Musaylama and the other one Quranic speech.
Muslim's speech about the elephant. الفيل وما أدراك ما الفيل. إله إله نذب وبيل وخربوم طويل. The elephant, and what will make you know what the elephant is? It has a big tail and a long trunk. Key differences. Shall I read that as well?
Yeah, read that as well.
Musaylima's version is childlike and nonsensical. The elephant has a tail and a trunk. The Qur'an's version tells a grand historical event with rhythm, meaning and power. Qur'an's rhetorical question, have you not seen, builds suspense and emphasizes divine intervention.
Okay, so that should have been read third. Okay, so someone read, one of the other girl, please read Surah Al-Fil.
سورة الفيل بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ألم تر كيف فعل ربك بأصحاب الفيل ألم يجعل كيدهم في تضليل وأرسل عليهم طيرا أبابيل ترميهم بحجارة من سجيل فجعلهم كعصف مأكول.
Can you?
Should I read the translation
Yeah,
as well?
please.
Have you not seen how your Lord dealt with the people of the elephant? Did he not make their plan go astray? And he sent against them birds in flocks, striking them with stones of baked clay, and he made them like eaten up straw.
So if you look at the last line, Al-Fil, Tadlil, Ababil, Sijil, Ma'kul. So the last line breaks it, but it rhymes. The last words, they rhyme. So it's in between poetry and in between sajja. And they say that the Meccan surahs are more closer to sajja than when we say it's sajja, but not really sajja. But the scholars do say that the Meccan surahs are more closer to sajja, more closer to poetry or sajja. I can't remember now. But even if I think it's more closer to poetry. If it was, my understanding is that the Quran wanted to prick the ears of the Arabians, right? So all of a sudden, this verses are coming down that sound like poetry, but the message is vastly different. It's breaking every convention of pre-Islamic poetry. Because pre-Islamic poetry was Nasib, Rahil, and then what was the last one again? Gharad. Whereas this now is something totally different, and it's commanding, and it's got those features that we'll go through in the book, inshallah. But we see the points here, yeah. So can the two guys, Safran and Thingy, can we have you read this? Sorry.
Musaylima's speech about the camel.
Yeah.
يا دفدع بنت سفدعين نكي كما تنقين لا الماء تقدرين ولا الشارب تمنعين. O frog, daughter of two frogs, croak as you always croak. You do not muddy the water, nor do you stop the drinker.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Quran, Surah Adiyat. والعاديات صبحا فالموريات قدحا فالمغريات صبحا فأنزلنا به نقعا فوسطنا به جمعا. By the chargers snorting, striking sparks of fire, launching raids at dawn, stirring up clouds of dust, penetrating into the enemy lines.
You want to read the key differences as well, Shahid?
Key differences are 1. Musaylima's revelation is childish, using repetitive sounds and simple imagery. 2. The Quran style is forceful, rhythmic and vivid, creating a powerful vision of battle. 3. Musaylima's content is trivial, a frog's croak, while the Quran evokes grandeur and awe.
So, on many ways, even if you don't know the sciences of how this works, just as a Muslim and knowing a little bit of the Quran or the Arabic language, you can see many problems here. First problem is when he's talking about a frog, because he's trying to compose verses and he can't get the verses out. He's not a poet. He's not Imrul Qais. He's not Antara or Tarafa. He's an idiot. So he's trying to compose verses and he's coming out with stupid imagery like this because there's no other way for him to compose the verse otherwise. So him talking about a frog is something incredibly low and incredibly stupid. Because when the Quran talks about even simple things, it evokes grandeur in Allah's creation. So when Allah gives the example of the bee, and then Allah tells you what the bee, the benefit it has for humankind. When Allah mentions the ant, the understanding we get is something even so small, able to communicate with a prophet. It's pointing towards the prophet as much as it's pointing towards the ant, and it shows us that ants live in social communities and they communicate with each other. Who would have thought that ants communicate before this? So it's showing the grandeur of Allah and His creation in the minute, and it links both ways. Whereas this failure on the left-hand side, who is a failed poet, he had to give the imagery of a frog, and he didn't build upon it. And even in his Arabic, when he's trying to get it to rhyme, all of a sudden, when he got daughter of two frogs, yani difta'in, ya difta'u, binta difta'in. Where shouldn't it be bintu difta'in? Right? Croak as you always croak, you do not muddy the water, nor do you stop the drinker. He's trying to rhyme it as a poem, and he's doing a terrible job here, and he's coming out with rubbish, basically. Whereas when Allah talks here, now this sounds like poetry on the right-hand side, right? And in its imagery, so it's multi-layered. It's like when the pre-Islamic poets speak, it's multi-layered. As I said to you, I said, if we get past the fact that they're talking about fighting and camels and women, if we get past that and we just look at the poem, what they're trying to do is they're writing on multi levels of understanding, and it's quite beautiful. Pre-Islamic poetry like that, it's quite beautiful. The Qur'an is doing the same thing. So when it builds the image by the charges snorting, when the horses snort, and you can see the air coming out of them, and in powerful bursts coming out, like in the cold night, in the cold day, you can see their breath coming out and the powerful noises they make. And when they're snorting, they're moving their heads and they're grinding their feet, and there's dust spreading everywhere, striking sparks of fire, launching raids at dawn, because raiding was done at dawn, right? So it's still cold. So at night time, the Arabs the raiding party would assemble outside the camp quietly. They would have camels, and then their horses would not be used. And then because they want the horses to be fresh. First thing in the morning, they get onto the horses and they charge into the camp. And in the morning, it's cold, so their breath condenses, and especially with the sun being low, it really has a powerful image of what that looks like. And that image builds. So when you see the chargers snorting, you're not just seeing breath, you're seeing a powerful horse, you're seeing a soldier on top of that horse with a spear, you're seeing chainmail, you're seeing armor. It just builds a whole picture. Launching raids at dawn, and then even the raiding is something dramatic, stirring up clouds of dust, penetrating into the enemy lines. And Antara would build poems on this. All the Arabs would actually, but especially Antara, if you read his poetry, penetrating into the enemy lines, and then breaking the line, and the fighting and the jostling and the swords flashing. It's just powerful imagery to whatever Allah wants to get to. Whereas on the other side, we've got this prophet here. O frog, daughter of two frogs, croak as you always croak. You do not muddy the waters, nor do you stop the drinker. It's just a very poor attempt at poetry, right? And if you look at the Arabic story of, like, you have the Umar series, and you have Antara series, and then you have Ahmad ibn Hanbal series. You also have, in the Umar series, you have Musaylama. He comes around at the end, right? And his people, he gets wahi, and his general is next to him, and then he starts to talk about his wahi, right? And it's to do with a pigeon or something. And it's so funny, you can see the general's face. The general just looks at him like, okay, cool, that's revelation, let's go. Meaning the general's thinking, you're just a fake, you're just a fraud, you're an idiot, and I'm just going along with the flow because you're just the rallying head for everybody. But I know inside that you're a fake. It was just so funny, the look on the general's face when he spoke. The general was like, yep, that's why let's carry on fighting. Right, example 3, Musaylima versus the Qur'an, Surah Al-Kawthar. Can we have The two girls, please. Rumais?
مسيلم's
Yeah.
speech. إنا أعطيناك الجوهر فصل لربك وهاجر إن مبغضك هو الكافر. Indeed, we have given you the jewel, so pray to your Lord and migrate. Indeed, your enemy is the disbeliever.
The other girl.
الكوثر فصل لربك وانهر إن شانئك هو الأبتر. Indeed, we have given you cut off. Key differences. Number one, Musaylama replaces al-Kawthar, abundance, with al-Jawhar, jewel, making it meaningless. Number two, Quran's version flows naturally, while Musaylama's forces a rhyme, migrates instead of sacrifice. And three, Quran's last verse cut off is powerful, while Musaylama's last verse is flat and weak.
Cool. Rumaisa, you said you learned Arud from your teachers. Are you starting to see some of that now, or what's going on here and the differences?
I'm not sure.
Are you starting to see how the power of, like, you can see Musaylama's speech here, how poor.
Yeah, I can understand the effects.
And just
I can
even if you
understand the
just compare
effects.
that to what we read about, like Imrul Qais's opening verse, right? How powerful was Imrul Qais's opening verse?
It was
It's much better
than
than this, right? And it
Yeah.
fitted onto a meter, and it had some reference, it had some deeper meaning. We know now that the Nasib has a deeper meaning to it also, depending on what they're trying to do. We know how it connects with the second part, the Takhallus, when they break free, why they break free, what they're trying to achieve in the third part. We know how it connects. Where is this guy's connections? There are no connections. This is not poetry, and this is not sajja. And the Quran, we can see now how the Quran is connecting themes. Everything the Quran says is incredibly deep. So Al-Kawthar, abundance, right? This is talking about the Hawd to Rasul at the end of time. And he knew what the abundance was. I mean, just the fact that he's changed the word Al-Kawthar into jewel knows that he knew exactly what abundance was. Right? And because he cannot match Rasulullah's abundance, which he's going to be given the hawd at the end of time, the next best thing for him is Jawhar, like jewelry, right? Jawhara. So he had to come out with jewel, right? So pray to your Lord and migrate. I mean, how does that even make sense, to pray to your Lord and migrate? Allah uses words like show steadfastness in prayer and fasting, or stuff like that, right? And then, so pray to your Lord and sacrifice. Indeed, your enemy is cut off. This is in reference to the Ibrahim, Rasul Sallallahu son died, and the kuffar would mock Rasul Sallallahu. His own family would mock Rasul Sallallahu and say he is abtar, he is cut off. Because the worst thing that for an Arab is to be cut off, not have a lineage. The lineage doesn't go through women, it goes through men. And his son died. So he's walking sad now through the town, and the Arabs are actually smirking at him and smiling and laughing and like tapping each other, saying, ha ha ha, huwa abtar, he's cut off. So Allah starts by giving a powerful thing. He says, He's given you abundance. Cut off? This is such a small thing. You will have everything you ever desire for. And your hawd, everybody is your ummati, and they'll be forced to come to drink from your hand. That's just one of the things I'm giving you. And they're talking about abtar, and then it works its way through the surah, mentioning a few other motifs and other subject matters, and then it ends back to the same thing. And he goes, indeed, your enemy, those are the cut off. You're not cut off. They're the cut off. They've got no lineage, no spiritual lineage. Finished. It ends here. Very, very powerful imagery. Conclusion, Safran, do you want to read?
Yeah, okay. Conclusion, why Musalima's revelations fell. No depth. Musalima's verses are childlike, repetitive, and lack impact. Artificial rhyme. He tries to mimic Quranic rhyme, but it sounds forced and weak. No eloquence. The Quran uses vivid, powerful language, whereas Musalima's speech is shallow. Lack of divine majesty. The Quran commands, challenges, and persuades, while Musalima's speech sounds trivial. This is why the Arabs, who were masters of language, immediately rejected Musalima's speech and mocked him. Even his own followers knew he was lying, but many followed him for political reasons. In contrast, the Quran's unique style stunned even the best poets of Quraysh, and no one could replicate its majesty. This is why it remains inimitable.
Excellent, well done, well done. So is the Quran saj'a, unique fusion of metrical and non-metrical speech? Some parts of the Quran follow the rules of poetry, that is, some verses can be described as one of the bihar. However, when the totality of the Quranic chapter that contains some of these poetic verses is analyzed, it is not possible to distinguish its literary form. This is reflected in the book Arabic literature to the end of the Umayyad period. The Quran is not verse, but it is rhythmic. The rhythm of some verses resembled the regularity of sajja, but it was recognized by Quraysh critics to belong to neither one nor the other category. These are references. The Quran achieves this unique literary form by fusing metrical and non-metrical speech in such a way that the difference cannot be perceived. So it basically blends them. So 1 minute it sounds like it's poetry, the next minute it sounds like it's prose, and it does it in such a beautiful way. Don't forget, it needs to take into account the subject material, what follows, and you're doing it in a way that it's indistinguishable. This is a miracle in itself. If we claim that the Arab poets could do that in just meters, the Quran is having to do the same thing, but from poetry to sajja. And the Quran, the Quran does it in a much better way, right? If the poets were to do it, they would fall short because nobody can match the Quran. We know this. This intermingling of metrical and non-metrical composition is present throughout the whole of the Quran. The following examples illustrate this. This is taken from Hamza Zorzi's book, by the way, right? I've linked it in the PDF. It's better you read it because you will understand. This is just one part of it. You'll understand the whole thing if you read it yourself. But this is the Quranic ayah. I tried to look at the Arabic, but I didn't understand what was going on. So I just left the Arabic out. This particular verse is talking about, we'll read it. But the righteous will be in gardens with springs, enter in peace and safety, and we shall remove any bitterness from their hearts. They will be like brothers sitting on couches face to face. No weariness will ever touch them, nor will they ever be expelled. Prophet, tell my servants that I am the forgiving, the merciful, but my torment is truly painful. While tell them too about Abraham's guests when they came to him and said, peace, he said, we are afraid of you. When reading the original Arabic of the above verse, the reader moves from metric composition to prose without experiencing the slightest change of style. The same mingling of metrical and non-metrical composition can be observed in the following verses of the Quran. When she heard their malicious talk, she prepared a banquet and sent for them, giving each of them a knife. She said, Joseph, come out and show yourself to them. And when the woman saw him, they were stunned by his beauty and cut their hands, explaining, Great God, he cannot be mortal. He must be a precious angel. She said, This is the one you blame me for. I tried to seduce him and he wanted to remain chaste. But if he does not do what I command, now he will be put in prison and degraded. The phrase, this is the one you blamed me for, in Arabic is poetic. It has a metrical structure in which the rules of Arabic poetry are observed. Commenting on this feature, Mitwali Ash-Sharawi states, it is almost impossible for the listener to detect the shift from one form to the other, nor does this exquisite mingling impinge on the fluidity of expression or impair its meaning. So let's have a look at poetry here. Ahad, you can see at the end. As-Samad, Lam Yalid, so Yalid, Yulad, and Walam Ahad. So this is something that looks a little bit like poetry, but it's not. And then قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ النَّاسِ مَالِكِ النَّاسِ إِلَهِ النَّاسِ مِنْ شَرِّ الْوَسْوَاسِ الْخَنَّاسِ الَّذِي يُوَسْوِسُ فِي صُدُورِ النَّاسِ مِنَ الْجِنَّةِ وَالنَّاسِ. So the end is the same here. Nas, Nas, Khannas, Nas, Nas, Nas. Wow. This looks like poetry, but it's not on any one particular meter. And then if we look at the Sajja, إِذَا زُلْزِلَتِ الْأَرْضُ زِلْزَالَهَا وَأَخْرَجَتِ الْأَرْضُ أَثْقَالَهَا وَقَالَ الْإِنسَانُ مَا لَهَا. Again, it's the same kind of Sajja going on here, but it doesn't conform to anything, and the meanings are very deep, and the way it just fits together is different. Experts will tell you much better than me. I'm not an expert. This is something that hit me, and I'm talking about it. One thing I observed in the Quran straight away. Ahmad Jalad mentioned this, and I took the idea from there. The contrast between the Quran and pre-Islamic poetry, particularly in how they orient themselves towards life, permanence, and meaning, right, is very different. Pre-Islamic poetry, while highly sophisticated and rich in imagery, often reflects a worldview steeped in the transient and the mortal. We've only read a little bit of pre-Islamic poetry, but we can see that it's to do with the transient. Everything is going, and sadness, and oh my God, what was there, now it's not there. Now I have to go to war. In war you die, you fight, you have to make your tribal honor. There's a chance that you won't, and you have to die doing it. Everything is about, if you don't do this, your name will not live. It's like you have to work so hard for your name to live, and then you still die. And everything is death anyway. So pre-Islamic poetry invites you to death, in my understanding, whereas the Quran invites you to life. How? Let's carry on reading. Often reflects a worldview steeped in the transient and the mortal. The motif of waquf al-atlal, standing by the ruins, is a poignant reminder of impermanence and decay, whereas poets lament lost loves, abandoned campsites, and the inevitability of time's destruction. The celebration of tribal glory and heroism is similarly fleeting, bound to the earthly world, and ultimately culminating in death with no clear sense of an eternal afterlife. This worldview often exudes despair, as the poets glorify temporary achievements in a world they acknowledge as fleeting and fragile. Whereas the Quran, by contrast, radically reorientates this perspective. Don't forget, right? They accuse Rasulullah of being a poet, right? And the Quran despises poetry, and the poetry it shows that they're clutching onto something in desperation. Whereas the Quran is a free ride, man. Don't be desperate. Just relax. Just ride the wave of the Quran, and you get a free ride to Allah. The Quran, by contrast, radically reorientates this perspective. It dismisses the focus on transient worldly glory and instead directs humanity's attention towards eternity, life after death, and divine purpose. The Quran offers hope and certainty, promising a life beyond death and an enduring connection with Allah, the source of all permanence. It reframes human existence, emphasizing that true glory lies in submission to Allah and preparation for the eternal life of the hereafter. Contrast between the two. Pre-Islamic poetry often reflects despair and resignation to death, while the Quran offers hope and life, pointing towards eternity and divine mercy. Focus on permanence. The Quran redirects attention from the transient tribal glory, ruins, fleeting emotions to the eternal, the afterlife, Allah's mercy and spiritual fulfillment. Purpose of language. Pre-Islamic poetry celebrates artistry for the sake of temporary glory and human admiration. The Quran, though beautiful in its language, uses that beauty as a means to connect humanity to truth and guidance, giving language a divine and eternal purpose. This is my understanding of the difference between the Quran and pre-Islamic poetry. There's a lot of sources for you here, lots of viewing, articles and viewing. Nabati poetry is a living tradition. Nabati poetry is the closest that you'd get to pre-Islamic poetry today. It's a living tradition. Listen to it, see what the Arabs think of it. It'll give you an idea. Literary history of the Arabs is something to do with Jahiliya. We'll touch upon it next week, but it's also included here in poetry as well. The Seven Oaths Suspended in the Temple of Mecca is a book written about 130-40 years ago by Orientalists. It's a good read. The poetry of Umayy ibn Salt. I think that may be Arabic, by the way. A lot of this poetry is in Arabic. You won't find it in English. A preliminary catalogue of Quranic Sajj. By the way, I wanted to read, we've ended, but I wanted to read something on Sajjah to give us more clarity. It's from Wikipedia, so I will open that now. So Sajjah was the earliest artistic speech in Arabic. It could be found in pre-Islamic Arabia amongst the Qur'ān, and in Abyssinia for ecclesiastical poetry and folk songs. One famous component of Sajjah was said to have been the bishop of Najran, Qus ibn Sa'id al-Iyadi. So the stylistic similarities between Sajj and the Quran have long been a matter of discussion, especially between Sajjah and the style of the earliest surahs. In Umayyad times, Sajjah was discredited as an artistic style for resembling the speech of soothsayers. This, however, did not stop people from composing Sajjah. Sajjah is the style of pre-Islamic Arabia. In the style of pre-Islamic Arabia, was still being written in Abbasid times and was being invoked in the same situation, like speeches before battles, the cursing of one's killers before their crime. Abu Bakr, after the image of Sajjah has been removed in large part thanks to a jihaz, it became major. Right, so let's see what it really is. In its simplest form, Sajjah consists of groups of consecutive qawla sharing a common rhyme and meter. Sajjah, though generally considered a subcategory of prose, nathar is a type of composition distinct from both free prose, mursal, which is free prose, and syllabic verse, nazm. It consists of rhyming phrases termed sajja'at. The rules governing the rhyme in sajjah are slightly different from those governing the rhymes in the qasida. The most noticeable difference being that the rhyme words in sajjah generally end in sakoon. Sajjah conforms to an accentual meter. Each sajjah tends to have the same number of word accents as its partner sajjas. Therefore, the fundamental unit of sajjah prosody is the word lafza and not the syllable or the taf'ila. This woman here, Angelica Newworth, check her up on YouTube. She's done some amazing stuff on the Quran. So short units rhyming in frequency, changing sound patterns, reiterating the last consonant and basing on common rhythm. So it's just, in English it's rhyming prose, but as a form of writing involves additional rules rarely exploited by Arabic critics beyond being close. Okay, you can read this for yourself, right? Another famous example is a piece attributed to, this is that Christian guy. O people, listen and retain. He who lives dies. He who dies is lost. Everything that could happen will happen. A dark night, a bright day, a sky that has zodiacal signs, stars that shine, seas whose waters roar, mountains firmly anchored, and earth spread out, rivers made to flow. Indeed, there are signs in the sky. There are lessons on the earth. What is the state of the people going and never returning? Have they been satisfied, thus choosing to reside there? Or were they abandoned? Are they sleeping? Qas swears an oath by God in which there is no sin. God has a religion that is more satisfactory to him and better than the religion in which you believe. Indeed, you do evil deeds in those that went before in eons past are instances for us to take heed. When I look at the watering holes of death from which there is no returning, when I see my people towards them going, young and old, the one who passed not coming back to me, and not from those who remain, he who goes, I become convinced that I without a doubt will go where the people have gone. So this, he's from Najran, so straight away we know he's a Christian. This would be very nice to see in the actual Arabic, by the way. Sajda in the Quran. Most believe that the Quran contained a significant amount of sajda, or that it has several formal features of sajda, but that it should not be described as such out of respect. Some theologians thought that some entire surahs were sajda, including Surah 53, Surah 54, 55. In Arabic manuals describing sajda, the vast majority of listed examples are from the Quran. While much of the Quran fits the criteria of sajda, not all of it does. Sajda is mostly in Meccan surahs. Okay, so it's not poetry, it's Meccan, it's sajda, as opposed to Medinan surahs, especially in early Meccan surahs. Sajda has short verses, with each verse being in one line. This is true of Meccan surahs. In Medinan surahs, verses become two-lined. 86% of the Quran is end rhymes. Ibn Athir defines 4 types of Quranic sajda: equal sajda when both lines of a sajda equal. You can take a read through this yourself. Read Al-Itqan. Prophetic hadith were commonly invoked over debates about legitimacy of the use of sajda. The most famous example is the hadith of the fetus. The context is that Muhammad is settling a dispute between 2 factions. One participant of the dispute suddenly begins using sajda as a rhetorical technique. Muhammad condemns him for doing this. While some cite this as evidence that Muhammad prohibited sajda, others have argued that Muhammad's prohibition was limited to the use of sajda in bolstering an illegitimate point. A number of other prophetic hadith also figured in debates about if sajda could be used in prayer. Some cited examples of Muhammad's prohibition of sajda in prayer, while others using sajda during prayer. This is, I've linked this, by the way, the Qur'an's unique literary form. This is where I took the quote from, by Hamza Zotzis. He's done an excellent job. And he mentions the Bihar. These are the Bihar. Bahur. And this is how they work, right? If you know your poetry. And then he's talking about Sajja. And then he's talking about Mursal. And then the Quran's literary form, Quranic Sajja, and the Quran's styles. Is the Quran Mursal? Mursal is normal speech. The Quran is not straightforward speech. For example, Inna a'tayna kal kawthar fasalli li rabbika wanhar inna shani'aka huwal abtar. Thar, har, tar. So it's not normal speech. It's clearly some form of sajja. Unique fusion of metrical and non-metrical speech. Quranic sajja. So read this for yourself, right? It's very interesting, and he's giving a lot of references here as well. It's linked here. You can just type in Quranic sajja by Hamza Zotsi's PDF and you'll find it. I think I've linked all of these. These are just extra. There was one thing I wanted to show you here, by the way. This is a poem of Labid. This is one of Labid's poems, and we'll hear this and then we'll call it a night. Can you hear this? Can you hear the music? You can't hear the music.
No.
Okay, I need to do something here. What's happened here? Screen sharing is paused. When did screen sharing become paused? How do I get the sound thing? Rumesa, you told me last time.
Also, if you go to the controls at the top, on the right-hand corner, there is a button that says More.
By the way, one
And if you
second.
press
It
it
said
says
screen sharing is paused. Does that mean that when I was speaking all this time, you couldn't see anything?
no. We can see the presentation slides, but if you've minimized the presentation, then it will say
No,
that
when I
it's
was
paused,
reading, I
meaning
was reading from Wikipedia and I was reading from Hamza Zotsi's book. Could you see Wikipedia? Or was you couldn't see it?
no, we couldn't, because I don't think
Oh
you
my God!
enabled
So that means,
the entire
oh, you lot
screen.
are patient, man. It would have got so boring for me if I was rambling half the time. If you saw the text, then you'd understand my ramble because I wasn't reading clearly, thinking that they can see the text themselves. All right, okay. So where do I go?
If you click more and it's on the top right hand corner, it should say share sound.
Share computer sound. Okay. Can you hear that? Can you hear that? Oh, let
No.
me try again.
No.
Share computer sound, stereo. Maybe if I share the second screen, right? How do I make sure that I can share all screens?
So if you go back up to the top and you press
Yep.
share, it will open up in the window and allow you to
Okay.
select the window you want to
Right,
share.
I've selected it, and can you hear that?
We can hear
Can you
it.
not see it?
Yeah, I can see it and I can
Right,
hear
okay,
it
so
as well.
this is the book by Hamza Zotzis, right? So this is what I was reading from right now. The Quran's unique literary form by Hamza Zotzis. This is what I was reading. So this is the Bahar. Can you see them now, yeah?
Yes.
Right, and this is how they work.
Yes.
And he's talking about what is Arabic prose, what is Sajja, Mursal, Quran and Sajja. Is the Quran poetry? Is it Sajja? Is it Mursal? It's brief, it's not too deep. And then this is the Wikipedia article I was reading, parts of what is Sajja, and this is the woman I told you about, the professor, the German Islamic studies scholar. If you can YouTube her, you'll see some good stuff. There's a video, I think, where she recently acknowledged that the Quran is not human speech. I was reading parts of this, by the way. Yeah, this is the Christian priest or high up Christian guy from Najran who I read this, and I'd like to see this in Arabic to see how he wrote it in Arabic. The Sajja in the Quran. So these are the surahs. They say that Surah 53, 54, 55 are pure Sajja. And why Meccan surahs are and Medina surahs are not in the same style. And it's just further research. I mean, Wikipedia, obviously, we take it with a pinch of salt, but it's just there for further research. And these books, I've linked to these books. One, two maybe in Arabic, the rest in English. Mufaddaliyat, this is the odes that came after the time of Jahiliya, and then the pre ones I've linked to as well. So cool, let's just watch this.
بمنى تأبد غولها
one of his poems.
عفت الديار محلها فمقامها بمنى تأبد غولها فرجامها فمدافع الريان عري رسمها خلقا كما ضمن الوحي سلامها دمن تجرم بعد عهد أنيسها حجج خلون حلالها وحرامها رزقت مرابع النجوم وصابها ودق الرواعد جودها فرهامها من كل سارية وغاد مدجن وعشية متجاوب إرزامها
The abodes are desolate, halting place, and encampment too. At Mina, deserted like gold, deserted alike Rajan, and the torrent beds of Arabian. Naked shows their trace, rubbed smooth, like letterings long since scored on a stony slab, blackened orts that, since the time their inhabitants tarried there, many years have passed over, months unhallowed and sacrosanct. The star-born showers of spring have fed them, the outpouring of thundercloud, great deluge and gentle following rain, the cloud that travels by night, the somber pall of morn, the outspread mantle of eve with muttering antiphon.
Okay, what I like about this, is the star-born showers of spring. See, who would have said this? The star-born showers of spring have fed them the outpour of thunderclouds. So in the Arabian desert, there's no rain, and when it rains, it really pours. So the star-born showers of spring have fed them the outpouring of thundercloud, great deluge, followed by gentle rain. So after the flood, you get pit-pat of slight rain. The clouds that travel by night, like the fast-moving heavy clouds, the somber pall of morn. In the morning, in the desert, it's cool, cold even, and it's like it's that twilight. It's the reverse of the twilight hour in the morning. The outspread mantle of eve with muttering antiphon. Now, for sure, written it's beautiful, imagery is beautiful, and the deeper meaning, I don't know what the deeper meaning is, but if it's literal, it's beautiful, and if there's a deeper meaning, there's probably something beautiful about this as well. But there's many, by the way. If you go onto YouTube, you can listen to the poems, but I don't feel comfortable with the way they're recited. Right, this poem, the way they recited it seemed okay to me. The other ones, I'm not sure how they recite it, but you can find there's so much stuff here. Look, poetry and prose. Ibn Hamd is a Sicilian. Reflections on lost youth and a usurping homeland. Anyway, that concludes our lecture. I wanted to do a little bit of more reading from the book regarding the Qur'an's. So the Qur'an has repetition as a device. It has dialogue as a device. It has other devices. It has parallelism. It has imagery. It has many other such things, and you need to get them all correct, and nobody can do that. That's why nobody can make a copy of the Quran. Is the Quran sajjah? This is written in the book as well. And then high frequency rhetorical features is analogy, alliteration, assonance, cadence, chiasmus, metaphor, parenthesis, stress. All of this is in the Quran. Inexact rhyme, great range of sajjah phrases, high frequency of rhetorical features. But this is just a taster for you. It's just a taster for, and then there's word order for you to maybe take this science forward and maybe study for yourself something. Can you see my screen, by the way? Hello, everybody. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
It's on the
No, we
YouTube
can't
page.
It's on the YouTube page.
Yeah.
Okay, let me just get that off. Is it on the right page now, yeah?
Yes.
All right, okay, so that concludes the three-part series on pre-Islamic poetry. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed making it and learning from teaching it. And I definitely benefited so much because this was one, I'll be honest with you, this was one area that I had diddly squat information about. I was always fascinated by Jahili poetry, but I didn't have a clue of what it was really about. So it's been very rewarding for me to make this presentation. And any last questions?
Nope, not from me. But that was fascinating. Thank you very much,
Welcome.
Ustad.
Safran, how'd you find it? Have you going?
Yeah, it was quite detailed. But obviously you mentioned that regarding obviously the Quran, to understand it. Obviously, if you don't have a background on the poetry side, you'll just see it as a warning, as a good news and laws, commands. But to embody the essence. I think you need to understand the poetry. And I just want to ask, also, you've given us these sources, but where do we start in terms of in order to appreciate the poetry side? Is it just the sources you gave us, or
If you want to
is there more
appreciate the
to that?
poetry, you start by learning the Arabic language, and
Okay.
then as your level of Arabic language gets deeper, you start to understand why certain word forms are used. So I was actually thinking this the other day. I was thinking this yesterday when I was doing an exercise here. I sorry, I could coin language, my own language, and poets often do this. They coin words. Alice in Wonderland, when there's words in there that are coined. There's other words in famous productions that people just make up the words as they go along because it just suits them and it goes well with what they're doing. So if I want to say, for example, I saw a lion walking in the park, right? And I could just say lion. That means lion walking in the park. I could say lionel. Now, lionel gives a slight different, in my world, it gives a slight different understanding. Lionel means a lion that's seen you and that is contemplating attacking you. Then I could say I saw a lioness. Lioness is a lion that's seen you, but it's hesitant. It's not contemplating. Then I could say I saw a lionan. A lionan is a lion that's seen you, it's contemplated, and now it's advancing. I saw a lionanna. That's a lion that you've seen, that's seen you, that's contemplated, but is withdrawing. So I could write a poem with using just these words, and you should just know these meanings that I coined up, but they give detailed understanding of what I'm trying to do. If I just say I saw a lion and the lion contemplated attacking me, and then it hesitated, and then it moved forward, that's a very long sentence. I can't say this in a part of balagha, part of rhetoric is to say things in the shortest amount of words properly and convey meaning. So how would I say it in a short way? I would say I saw a lionan, which means I saw a lion that contemplated attacking and it retreated. I've just said it in one word. So with the Arabic language is incredibly rich like this, incredibly rich like this. There's so many different words for lions. A lion attacking, Haider, right? A lion doing something else is called something else, and an Asad, and a lion doing something else, like even with feel or even with camel, they have so many different names for the same thing, but it actually means something slightly different than that. So for example, a camel eating, you can call this. A camel lying, you can call this. A camel angry, call it this. A camel sitting, call it this. A camel walking, call it this. So when you write poetry now, and you use those words, you're giving detailed imagery to the person. The Qur'an does that. I had something here, oh my God, maybe next week if I find it. It was a breakdown of certain words in poetry and why the poet chose those words. If you study tafsir of Qur'an in the Arabic language, you'll see why Allah chooses certain words. Allah could have chosen one word, but He ended up choosing another word. Why? Because of the ever so slightly nuance in difference in meaning. So your first step would be to learn the Arabic language to get a true understanding of what's going on with pre-Islamic poetry. This is the reason why it's touched upon in the madaris. They touch upon it because they teach you words, not so much to speak, but they teach you words with the changing of meanings, right? And that's part of the whole, balagha and grammar and sarf and nahu, is to teach you slight variations of the same word, and then you look at the poetry and you say, oh, he's used this word here. This is what he's trying to imply. Oh my God, he's a genius. And then you look at the Qur'an and see Allah doing the same thing, and you're like, oh my God, now I know what Allah's trying to say, and what a beautiful way of explaining it. What an amazing thing Allah has done here. And that's where tafsir comes in, because there's a transmission-based tafsir like Ibn Kathir, just put together every evidence out there and give it to you. And then there's a linguistic-based tafsir. And the linguistic based tafsirs are very, very interesting because you're looking at the words of the Arabic language and why Allah chose word orders and certain languages and what He was trying to imply by using those specific words. Right? And poetry, this is why poetry is so beautiful, because poetry has this inside it anyway. Right? So if you want to start, look at all of the links that I gave. There's a lot to go through, but have a look at those links and then learn the Arabic language, learn balagha, learn tafsir of Qur'an, get yourself a teacher, and you're there. You can see Nu'man Ali Khan, he does that a lot in probably the most beautiful way that you've seen anybody do it. He will, like Surat Abasa, if you look at his commentary on that, oh my God, it's phenomenal. The way he uses the word, breaks down the words, telling you why Allah chose to use this word and how this word ties in with previously what Allah said and what Allah will say next. It's absolutely amazing. You understand this, Safran?
Understand? Yeah. But would you say like what you've done? This is just like, is this like a summary?
This is just a surface level touch. Before yesterday, before 5 days ago, even though I knew bits of what I'm talking about, like little, very little, I just learned this subject in a week, you can say. So this is a touch. I've just touched it, and it's interested me hugely, and I hope it interests you. And it's interested me to a degree where I want more of this, man.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously basically just to give us an understanding,
Yes.
isn't it? Obviously, it's a surface level, but obviously to get to the deeper levels, we'll need to know the Arabic language or whatever. But this is like a short course, you could say, like just to touch, just for English-speaking students, just to get an understanding of the Arabic poetry, pre-Islam.
Yeah.
In a nutshell,
Yeah,
is
yeah.
that
This
right?
was just a taster.
The other question I had was, I think one of the Sahabas, obviously, on one of the slides, he mentioned the Prophet ﷺ. He described him as a sharp Indian sword, one of the swords of Allah's. I just wanted to ask, like, were the Arabs, obviously, I'm guessing, did they travel to India? Like, why would they describe him as an Indian sword? I don't know if they were traveling to India, because Indian swords, I don't know if you know, but they're known to be sharp, curved and sharp. So I was
Okay,
just curious to know
Indian
about that.
sword, Indian steel, Damascus steel and Indian steel was considered the two best steel that you could get in Arabia. And
Okay.
Damascus swords were straight and Indian swords were curved. And each has a different purpose in warfare. And the Indian sword was a prized sword because number one, it curved, and number two, it was superior quality. So when he's trying to compare Rasulullah with a sword, they had never been to India, but they knew what Indian swords were, right? And when he's trying to compare Rasulullah with an Indian sword, he's saying the best of the archetype of what the Rasul is, i.e. a human, the best of humans, like an Indian sword flashing in the sun as opposed to rusting other swords, right? So he's using imagery that he's familiar with, which was simple imagery. The Arabs were very simple. They described Rasulullah as a sword, his face as a sword, right? And if I described your face as a sword, you would say, like Shahid would say, what kind of a description have you described him as? I mean, is his face really long or something? Like, is it very long and narrow at the edges, and like, is it like a strange shape? That's the image that everybody gets. But if you look at it from the Arab context, they're referring to, this is why Jahiliya poetry is so important. This is why knowing the Arabic language in context is very important, because otherwise you won't know these things. A sword describing Rasul as a sword basically meant he's fair. Compared to the other Arabs, he was a notch fairer, because a sword glints. The sword is like silver. The sword shines in the daytime. In pre-Islamic poetry, they're always talking about the sun shining in the sword, the sun glinting off the sword. So describing Rasul as a sword is saying that this is the most superior, beautiful example of humankind. Do you understand?
Indian sword, obviously, they hadn't traveled to India, but Indian sword was quite well known as well, even in
It was
Arabia
well
at that
known,
time.
yes. Yes.
Is that right? Okay. Okay, and it was because it was one of the, it was Damascus steel and Indian steel, so was
Yeah,
one of the best
if
at
I'm
the
not
time
mistaken, I
described
think
the Rasulullah
Damascus steel
sallallahu
is Indian steel that they just took from India and made swords out of it in Damascus. I'm not sure about this, but I know Indian steel definitely was considered the world's best.
Okay, all right. Last question. Regarding obviously a lot of these Arab poets. Before you mentioned that their poetry involved speaking in first person as opposed to third person, something along the lines, because first person made it seem more how do I
Authentic,
say
more credible.
yeah, authentic, yeah, more credible. And I think you mentioned before that if there was a poem where it's mentioned he says or she says or like, he says or whatever, like third person, like it wouldn't be authentic. But my question is, let's say there's a report of an event where there's been a lot of witnesses to it. So what would be the issue of using he
They
says
give chains they give chains of narration
narrated?
to that, right? So
Mm,
nobody will say he says and then give a chain of narration. What they will do is they imply he says and she says. So Tabari will imply. So how is he doing that? He will give you 4 or 5 narrations, first person accounts with their chains of narration. So he will say so and so reports from so and so, I saw X, Y, and Z do this. Right? That's how all hadith work. I saw Rasulullah do this,
mhm.
reported from so and so, so and so, so and so. So if the story is different, they'll just put all of the first person narrations in, but they'll keep it first person. But when you say third person, it can't happen. I heard from so and so, from so and so, that he said so and so. Right? So that's the only way you can do it now, and you very rarely get that in Islamic literature. And when you do get that, it it's not as credible. Right? Another way of looking at it is when we gossip. He says, she says, he says, she says. That's the worst thing that a Muslim can get embroiled in. Sitting down and saying, he said this, she said this. This is gossip now. And most gossip is exaggeration and lies, and it's malicious. So when you hear he says, she says, third person accounts, you have to start thinking, well, they're not as credible as first person, because where is the first person report? If it was a credible report, where is the first person report? And that's the exact same problem that happens with the hadith of. I didn't want to tell all of you this, right? I wanted to, hit the bombshell on the head when we got there, right? But the hadith of Rasulullah regarding suicide, let's get this clear, everybody. Yes, Rasulullah was supposed to have jumped off the mountain and ended it. Na'udhu billah. It's to do with he says. And he says is not credible.
But let's suppose there's a case where there's a major event, but like I don't know, like but we don't have the authentic source, but it's been well reported. Can that be a case? Like, for example, there's a major event that's happened. There's a lot of it's well known, but nobody really knows who was the like original who was the first person to report it, or like, but it was well known in the community, if
No,
that makes
if
sense.
it's a well-known report, you're gonna know who reported
Mm.
it. Right? Otherwise, it's a well-known story with no base, and then that's not credible.
Okay, yeah, let's see. All right.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Right.
Any last questions before we go? All right. Thank you very much, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I enjoyed making it. By the way, homework. You need to write a poem. Now, I know people are thinking, oh my God, I'm not a poet, but this is a labor of love. I don't care if you're a poet or not a poet. It's not about poetry. It's about your connection, what comes out of your heart, even if it doesn't need to rhyme. It can be mursal, man. It can just be mursal. Just write it down. What's your feeling for Rasulullah? It can be 5 words, it can be 10 words, it can be a qasida of 100 lines. I just want to see what level you're at, what comes out of your heart, what stage you're at in. And we want to build upon this. So by the end of the course, you're going to have a book of something like 50 poems, even if they're mursal, even if they're words about Rasulullah, but we want to see your transition. We have not really touched on any subject of Rasulullah's life. There's no love yet. So it's important that we write 1 or 2 poems to see what your level of attraction or connection or love for Rasulullah is now. And then as we start the Seerah, we want to write more poems to see if there's been a transition, if there's been a deepening or an awakening or a realization, or there's become a weakness in you for Rasulullah. That's why I want the development of poetry from now. So just write something, right? Just write something. You need to present something for next week, inshallah, and you need to present something in the Jahili style, right? You need a Nasib, a Rahil, and a Gharab. Okay? That's going to be difficult, but we're all going to have a laugh. It's all about enjoying ourselves and connecting with Rasulullah. It's a very interactive class. So we're all going to stumble on that one. I'm going to stumble on that one as well, right? But don't worry. We can do this, inshallah. Okay?
So Ustad, is it two poems? One's just a general poem and one that follows a classical Arabic structure, is that right?
Yeah, and the Arabic structure that it follows, I'll post it up on the group so that you know exactly what to do. Yeah?
Okay.
All right. Barakallahu feek.
Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you so much. Sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله عدد كمال الله وكما يليق بكماله. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على أسعد ما محمد وعلى آله عدد كمال الله وكما يليق بكماله. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على نور الهدى محمد وعلى آله عدد كمال الله وكما يليق بكماله. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.